Picture a city that once housed over 1 million people with marble palaces gleaming in the sun. Magnificent aqueducts delivered fresh mountain water to every neighborhood, while merchants from 3 continents traded exotic goods in bustling forums. Now imagine walking through that same city 400 years later and finding only 30,000 souls wandering among crumbling ruins. This isn't fiction, this is the story of Rome. Now, and Rome wasn't alone. Across an empire that stretched from Britain to the Sahara, magnificent cities that had thrived for centuries simply vanished. What if everything you thought you knew about civilization was wrong? What if the greatest urban achievements in human history could disappear, not through war or disaster, but through the slow breakdown of systems we take for granted? Tonight, we're going to explore one of history's most haunting mysteries and discover parallels to our own world that might keep you awake long after this story ends. In this video, we'll uncover why the greatest urban civilization the ancient world had ever seen just disappeared. If you like these videos, I would appreciate if you clicked like or subscribed, as it's important for the channel and it helps others find it too, just like you did. Thank you. Now, let's get started. Long before our modern cities reached toward the sky, there was an empire where urban life flourished on a scale that wouldn't be matched again for over 1,000 years. The Romans, you see, had figured something out that most civilizations only dreamed of. They knew how to build cities that actually worked. Think about Rome at its peak, around the year 400. Over 1 million people called this place home. That's more than many of our major cities today had just 2 centuries ago. And these weren't people crammed into slums, struggling to survive. Well, not all of them anyway. The city hummed with an energy that would make modern Manhattan seem quiet. Water flowed through the streets like liquid silver. 11 massive aqueducts stretched their stone fingers across the countryside, pulling fresh mountain water from springs 60 miles away. Every single day, these engineering marvels delivered 300 million gallons of water. That's enough for 2 million people by today's standards. And here's the thing that really gets you thinking. Some neighborhoods in Rome had better water pressure than parts of our world do right now. The forum buzzed with languages from 3 continents. Merchants speaking Celtic dialects haggled with traders from Alexandria. Germanic tribespeople examined silk that had traveled thousands of miles from China. Spices from what we now call Sri Lanka perfumed the air alongside the scent of leather, bronze, and fresh bread, but Rome was just the crown jewel. Across the empire, cities bloomed like flowers after rain. London, though they called it Londinium then, housed 50,000 souls. Ships crowded the Thames, carrying British wool to distant markets and bringing back wine, pottery, and luxuries from Gaul. The city boasted Roman baths, where citizens could soak in heated pools, an amphitheater for entertainment, and streets that stayed reasonably clean thanks to sophisticated drainage systems. Paris, or Lutetia, as it was known, perched on its island in the Seine like a jewel in a crown. Stone bridges connected the settlement to both riverbanks. An arena seated 15,000 spectators who cheered gladiators and wild beast hunts. Natural hot springs fed public baths, where people from all walks of life could wash away the day's troubles. Even cities we barely remember today once thrived with populations that wouldn't be seen again in Europe for centuries after Rome's decline. Places like Trier in Germany or Toulouse in France hummed with commercial activity and cultural sophistication. What made this all work wasn't just Roman engineering, though their skills were remarkable. It was something deeper, something almost mystical about human organization. Every Roman city followed a similar blueprint. Straight roads intersected at perfect right angles. A central forum served as the beating heart of commerce and politics. Public buildings were positioned with mathematical precision. Military engineers designed walls that could withstand sieges that wouldn't come for decades. The people who built these places understood something we sometimes forget today. Cities aren't just collections of buildings. They're living organisms that need constant care, constant feeding, constant attention. The Romans fed their urban creatures with trade routes that stretched from Britain's foggy shores to the sun-baked markets of North Africa. Archaeological discoveries continue to amaze us. Roman coins turn up in Vietnamese excavations. Chinese silk fragments emerge from British graves. Indian spices season recipes found on walls in Pompeii. This was globalization 1500 years before we thought we invented it. A merchant from Alexandria could travel to Cologne and feel remarkably at home. The same style of public baths welcomed him. Similar shops lined familiar-looking streets. His Roman coins worked just fine. Latin got him through most conversations. It was like being part of history's first truly international community. The sheer audacity of it all takes your breath away. Imagine convincing 1 million people to live together in one place when most of the world still organized itself around tiny villages. Imagining engineering water systems that worked flawlessly for centuries. Imagine creating trade networks so reliable that British hunting dogs became status symbols in Roman households, while Roman glassware graced tables in far-off India. But civilizations, even the most impressive ones, carry the seeds of their own transformation within them. Rome's cities represented something revolutionary, the idea that vast numbers of people could cooperate, prosper, and build something greater than the sum of their individual efforts. Yet they also depended on systems so complex, so interconnected, that damage to one part could cascade through the whole network like dominoes falling. The story of what happened next isn't really about barbarian invasions, though those played their part. It's not even primarily about political collapse, though that happened too. It's about something more subtle and perhaps more terrifying. It's about how quickly the impossible can become inevitable, how rapidly the unthinkable can become unavoidable. By the year 800, Rome's population had crashed to maybe 30,000 people. London was practically abandoned. Paris survived, but as a shadow of its former self. Weeds grew through the cracks in roads that had once carried traffic from 3 continents. Wild animals denned in temples where incense had once risen to honor gods whose names were already being forgotten. The transformation didn't happen overnight. It unfolded across generations, so gradually that people living through it might not have noticed how dramatically their world was changing. A trade route would become unreliable. A public bath would close for repairs that never came. A neighborhood would empty as families moved away, never to return. What fascinates historians most is how completely the knowledge disappeared along with the cities. The engineering techniques that built those aqueducts, the organizational methods that fed those populations, the commercial networks that connected continents, all of it seemed to simply evaporate like morning mist. Medieval Europeans would gaze at Roman ruins with wonder, convinced that giants or wizards must have built them. The idea that ordinary humans had once possessed such capabilities seemed impossible. They were looking at the remnants of a civilization that had solved problems medieval society couldn't even properly understand, let alone address. This wasn't just urban decline. This was the unraveling of humanity's first great experiment in large-scale city living. And the echoes of that unraveling would shape European development for the next 1,000 years. Picture a place where human ambition reached heights that wouldn't be seen again for centuries. Imagine walking through streets so carefully planned that modern engineers still study them today. There was a time, long ago, when cities rose from nothing to become monuments to what people could achieve when they dreamed big. Let's wander back to the year 150 AD, when the world looked very different than it does now. There was a city called Trier, nestled in what we now call Western Germany. Most people today have never heard of it, but back then it was something extraordinary. They called it the Rome of the North, and that wasn't just empty boasting. Imagine you're a merchant who's traveled far and wide, carrying goods across dangerous roads. You've seen many settlements, most of them small and cramped. Then you arrive at Trier on a cool autumn morning, and everything changes. The first thing that would stop you in your tracks isn't the noise or the smell, it's the sheer size of everything. The walls around this city stretched for more than 4 miles, wrapping around the entire settlement like a stone embrace. These weren't simple barriers thrown up in haste. Each wall stood 30 feet high, built from massive limestone blocks that had been quarried, shaped, and fitted together with mathematical precision. 47 defensive towers dotted these walls, standing like silent guardians watching over the countryside. What's remarkable is how these walls weren't just about defense. Roman engineers built drainage systems right into the foundation, understanding that water could destroy stone faster than any enemy army. They thought about problems that wouldn't occur for decades, planning for a future they'd never see. The entrance gates looked like monuments to victory, each one designed to impress anyone approaching the city. The Black Gate, which archaeologists call the Porta Nigra, still stands today after nearly 2,000 years. Walking through it, back then must have felt like entering another world entirely. Once inside, your senses would be overwhelmed in the most wonderful way. The rhythmic hammering from metal workshops created a steady heartbeat for the city. Wooden wheels rumbled over stone streets that had been laid with the kind of precision we associate with modern highways. Voices called out in languages from across the known world, Latin mixing with Celtic tongues, Germanic dialects blending with words from distant provinces. The smells told their own stories. Fresh bread wafted from bakeries where bakers started work before dawn. The sharp tang of leather drifted from workshops where craftsmen turned animal hides into goods that would travel across continents. Exotic spices from trading posts carried hints of faraway lands that most people would never see. And yes, occasionally there were less pleasant odors from the sewers, because even the most advanced cities have their challenges. Now here's something that might surprise you. This city housed around 80,000 people at its peak. That number might not sound overwhelming by today's standards, but consider this remarkable fact. Paris, one of Europe's greatest cities, wouldn't reach that same population again until the 1100s. That's nearly 1,000 years later. Unlike medieval cities that grew organically, spreading outward in whatever direction seemed convenient, Trier was planned with mathematical precision that would impress modern city planners. The main street, called the Cardo Maximus, ran perfectly straight through the heart of the city. It was wide enough for 2 full-sized Roman wagons to pass each other comfortably, with room to spare. Along this grand avenue stood buildings that would make our modern shopping centers look almost quaint. 3-story structures lined the street, each one carefully designed for maximum efficiency. Workshops occupied the ground floors, where craftsmen could display their wares to passing customers. Living quarters filled the second floors, providing comfortable homes for families. Storage areas in the upper levels kept goods safe and dry. The building facades were works of art in themselves. Colorful frescoes and intricate mosaics decorated every surface, telling stories of gods and heroes, celebrating successful business deals, commemorating important events. Walking down this street would have been like strolling through an outdoor art gallery, where every surface had something interesting to see. But here's where Roman urban planning becomes truly impressive, in ways that go beyond mere aesthetics. Every single building in Trier was connected to not one, but 2 separate water systems. Think about that for a moment. In an age when most people got their water from wells or rivers, every building in this city had running water. The first system brought fresh drinking water from springs in the Eifel Mountains, 30 miles away. Roman engineers calculated the exact gradient needed, just a gentle slope of 2 feet per mile. Too steep, and the rushing water would erode the channels. Too shallow, and the water would stagnate. They got it exactly right, creating a flow that remained steady for centuries. The second system carried wastewater away through an underground network that modern sanitation engineers still admire. These weren't simple ditches, but carefully engineered tunnels with proper slopes, access points for maintenance, and overflow channels for heavy rains. Now let's talk about something that still gives historians chills when they study it. The Imperial Baths of Trier covered nearly 15 acres. That's bigger than 10 football fields, all dedicated to bathing and relaxation. But these weren't just places to get clean. They were social clubs, business centers, gymnasiums, and spas all rolled into one magnificent complex. The hot room, called the Caldarium, was heated to a comfortable 104 degrees Fahrenheit by an ingenious system called the hypocaust. Hot air circulated through hollow walls and floors, warming every surface evenly. Romans would spend hours in these baths, not just cleaning themselves, but conducting business deals, sharing gossip about politics, playing board games, getting massages with imported oils from distant provinces. Imagine having a place like that in your neighborhood, somewhere you could go every day to relax, socialize and handle business, all at the same time. It's a concept that modern society has somehow lost, this idea of bathing as a communal social experience, rather than a private necessity. The city's amphitheater showcases another level of Roman ingenuity. This arena could seat 20,000 spectators, which means 1 in 4 residents could attend events at the same time. But the engineering behind it was pure genius. Instead of building it from the ground up, the builders carved it directly into a hillside, using the natural slope for seating while creating elaborate underground chambers. These chambers housed gladiators before their contests, wild animals brought from across the empire, and sophisticated stage machinery that could create spectacular effects. They even installed a drainage system that could flood the entire arena floor, allowing for mock naval battles that recreated famous victories. All of this happened in a world without power tools, without modern machinery, without the technology we take for granted. Every stone was cut by hand, every measurement calculated with simple instruments, every complex curve created through pure mathematical understanding and human skill. The people who built Trier understood something profound about human nature. They knew that cities aren't just places where people live and work. They're stages where human drama unfolds, where cultures meet and blend, where ideas spread and evolve. They built, not just for practical needs, but for the human soul's desire for beauty, community, and wonder. These Roman engineers and architects were creating something that would inspire people 2,000 years later. They were building dreams in stone and mortar, creating urban spaces that acknowledged both human needs and human aspirations. Picture a world where you could flood an entire arena for sea battles, then watch every drop of water vanish in less than 60 minutes. The Romans didn't just build cities, they crafted entire universes of possibility. What made these ancient places truly magical wasn't the grand architecture, though that was spectacular enough. It was the incredible tapestry of human life, woven through every street corner. Walk through the markets of a Roman city like Trier, and you'd find yourself surrounded by voices speaking dozens of languages, each merchant bringing treasures from the far corners of the known world. A British trader might be haggling over thick woolen cloaks, perfect for those chilly northern winters. Right beside him, a craftsman from Gaul would display pottery so fine, it seemed almost too beautiful to use for everyday meals. Germanic metalworkers hammered away at their forges, creating jewelry and tools that sparkled with an artistry passed down through generations. But here's where it gets really fascinating. These weren't just local goods changing hands. Archaeological evidence shows us trade routes stretching impossibly far, bringing exotic spices from India, silks that had traveled the entire breadth of Asia from distant China. In a single afternoon of shopping, you could purchase British ale, Italian wine, Spanish olive oil, and amber jewelry from the Germanic forests, all in one bustling marketplace. The wealthy Romans lived like kings in their sprawling villas, each room heated by an ingenious system of underground pipes and furnaces. Their floors told stories through intricate mosaics, depicting gods and heroes from ancient myths, each tiny tile placed with careful precision. Private courtyards offered peaceful retreats from the busy city streets outside. Even ordinary citizens enjoyed luxuries that wouldn't return to Europe for many centuries after Rome fell. Those apartment buildings, called insulae, rose several stories high, housing families in spaces that featured running water, a marvel of engineering that most medieval Europeans could hardly imagine. Shared bathrooms came equipped with, well, let's call it the ancient version of toilet paper, sponges attached to sticks that served the same essential purpose. Ground floor shops buzzed with activity from dawn to dusk. Residents could step outside their front doors and buy fresh bread still warm from the baker's oven, or perhaps some imported silk that had traveled thousands of miles to reach their neighborhood store. The diversity of these cities would make even modern metropolitan areas seem provincial by comparison. Tombstones from Trier tell us stories of lives lived across vast cultural divides. People from Africa, Syria, Spain, Britain, and countless Germanic tribes all called the same streets home. They worked together, traded together, built families together. A Syrian spice merchant might share a wall with a British soldier's family. A Germanic craftsman's daughter could fall in love with a Greek wine trader's son. These weren't isolated incidents, but the natural rhythm of daily life. This level of cultural blending wouldn't appear again in European cities until our own modern era. The technology would have seemed like pure magic to anyone from outside the Roman world. City workers maintained oil lamps along the streets, lighting them each evening as darkness fell, extinguishing them again at dawn. Walking through a Roman city at night meant navigating by steady, reliable light, something most human settlements had never experienced. Public libraries held thousands of scrolls, creating repositories of knowledge that preserved everything from poetry to engineering manuals. Children attended schools, where they learnt to read and write in Latin, the universal language that connected every corner of the empire. A postal system carried messages across vast distances, with a speed and reliability that wouldn't be matched again until the telegraph changed everything over 1,000 years later. Perhaps most remarkable was the sheer ambition behind Roman city planning. These weren't settlements that had grown organically around some convenient river crossing or defensive hilltop. Every Roman city followed a master plan, designed as a smaller version of Rome itself, complete with the same types of buildings, the same civic institutions, the same basic institutions. You could travel from Hadrian's Wall in the misty hills of northern England all the way to the edge of the Sahara Desert in Africa, and everywhere you stopped, the cities would feel familiar. Same forum in the center, same bathhouses, same amphitheaters. It was like having a franchise system for civilization itself, ensuring that Roman citizens could feel at home anywhere in their vast world. The economic sophistication behind all this urban planning was truly mind-blowing. Banks in Trier could transfer money to accounts in distant cities, enabling merchants to conduct business across the empire without carrying heavy coins on dangerous roads. Insurance companies protected valuable cargo during those long trading journeys, understanding risks and calculating premiums with mathematical precision. What we might recognize today as corporations already existed, business partnerships designed to outlast their original founders, operating simultaneously across multiple cities. The Romans had essentially invented the multinational company, 15 centuries before anyone else thought to try it. Think about the incredible confidence required to build on such a scale. Roman engineers weren't planning for their own lifetimes, or even their children's lifetimes. They built for eternity. Those massive aqueducts stretching across valleys were designed to serve cities for centuries. Road networks were planned to handle traffic loads that wouldn't be seen again until the age of automobiles. Amphitheaters and bathhouses rose from the ground with the assumption that Roman civilization would last forever, and for over 400 years it seemed like they were absolutely right. Cities like Trier didn't just survive, they flourished, constantly growing and innovating. If you were a Roman citizen in the year 150, watching your city expand and improve with each passing decade, you might reasonably have assumed your great-grandchildren would inherit an even more magnificent world than the one you knew. But beneath all this urban magnificence lay something far more fragile than anyone realized. The economic engine powering these miracles was incredibly complex, interconnected in ways that made the entire system vulnerable to disruptions no one saw coming. What seemed like unshakable confidence was actually built on foundations that could crumble faster than anyone imagined possible. The very sophistication that made Roman cities so impressive also made them incredibly dependent on perfect conditions. When those conditions began to change, the entire magnificent system would face challenges that its brilliant creators never anticipated. The economic machine behind all those urban wonders was more ruthlessly efficient than anything the world had seen, but that efficiency came with a price that would eventually demand payment. Picture a world where business flowed like water, across continents, where a single idea could travel thousands of miles and transform into profit. This was the Roman Empire at its peak, a place where economic dreams came alive in ways that wouldn't be seen again for centuries. Let's step into the sandals of a merchant, someone we might call Marcus. He's sitting in his comfortable villa, overlooking the bustling harbour of Aquileia. Ships come and go, their sails filled with Mediterranean winds, carrying treasures from every corner of the known world. Marcus isn't just any trader, he's part of something bigger, something revolutionary. The year is 180 AD, and news travels fast in this empire. The Roman postal system, you see, could deliver messages faster than anything Europe would witness again, until the 1800s arrived. That morning, Marcus receives word that Alexandria needs wool, British wool specifically. Now, most people might think this sounds impossible, but Marcus sees opportunity dancing before his eyes. Within days, he's set in motion a plan that spans continents. Wool will travel from the misty hills of northern Britain, down Roman roads to Londinium, then by ship, across the English Channel. The journey continues down French rivers, across the Mediterranean, finally reaching the textile workshops of Egypt. 4,000 miles, a dozen provinces, one seamless operation. What made this possible wasn't magic, it was something far more impressive. The Romans had created a world where business could flourish without barriers. One currency flowed through every marketplace, one legal system protected every contract, one set of measurements made sense everywhere. Imagine conducting business today with such simplicity, such unity. Modern economists study Roman trade records and find themselves amazed. 50 million tons of goods moved annually through this empire, matching the peak trade volumes of medieval Europe, but this happened over 1,000 years earlier. The scale seems almost impossible to believe. The foundation of this economic miracle lay beneath everyone's feet. Roman roads stretched like arteries through the empire, 25 major highways covering 50,000 miles, with another 200,000 miles of smaller routes connecting villages and towns. These weren't simple dirt paths, they were engineering marvels. Multiple layers of stone created foundations that lasted centuries. Drainage systems kept them passable in any weather. Mile markers helped travelers track their progress. Rest stops provided food and shelter, creating an ancient version of highway infrastructure. A merchant could travel from Rome to Cologne, 800 miles, in just 40 days. Medieval travelers would need twice as long for the same journey. Speed meant everything in this world. Fresh goods reached distant markets. Spoilage dropped dramatically. Merchants could respond quickly when opportunities arose. Time, as they say, was money, and the Romans had figured out how to buy more of it, but the roads were just the beginning. Roman bankers had created systems that seem remarkably modern. Letters of credit allowed merchants to deposit coins in one city and withdraw equivalent amounts in another. No need to carry heavy bags of money across dangerous territories. Insurance policies protected against shipwrecks, bandit attacks, even natural disasters. Joint stock companies pooled resources for major ventures, spreading both risk and reward among multiple investors. International banking connected distant markets, making complex trades possible. A wool merchant in Britain could partner with a textile producer in Egypt, despite never meeting face-to-face. Archaeological discoveries continue revealing the sophistication of Roman commerce. Near Hadrian's Wall, researchers found business documents that read like modern contracts. Quality standards, delivery schedules, penalty clauses, insurance provisions, dispute resolution procedures. These weren't simple handshake deals, they were legally binding agreements with teeth. The fortress of Vindolanda yielded particularly fascinating records, trade contracts between British and Gaulish merchants that specified every detail imaginable, payment terms, quality requirements, What happened if goods arrived late or damaged? This level of commercial protection wouldn't return to Northern Europe until Renaissance bankers rediscovered these ancient practices. Think about conducting business with such security 2,000 years ago. Merchants could sleep peacefully, knowing their investments were protected by law, their transactions insured against disaster, their profits backed by the might of empire. Risk existed, certainly, but it was manageable, calculable, something that could be planned around. The psychological impact of such stability cannot be overstated. When people trust the system, when they believe their efforts will be rewarded fairly, economic activity explodes. Merchants took bigger risks, invested in longer-term projects, expanded into new markets. Innovation flourished because failure wouldn't mean complete ruin. Regional specialization emerged naturally. Within this framework, Britain became famous for wool, Spain for silver, Egypt for grain, Gaul for pottery. Each province developed expertise in what it produced best, then traded freely with others. The empire became a vast economic organism, each part supporting the whole. Urban centers grew around trade routes, transforming from simple settlements into bustling commercial hubs. Aquileia, where our merchant Marcus lived, became a crucial link between northern and southern trade networks. Ships from across the Mediterranean docked at its harbors, while caravans from the northern provinces arrived daily. Markets buzzed with activity as exotic goods changed hands. Silk from distant China, spices from India, amber from the Baltic, precious stones from Africa. The empire had become a magnet, drawing wealth and luxury from every direction, concentrating it within Roman borders. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect was how ordinary this extraordinary system seemed to its participants. For Marcus and millions like him, global trade was simply how business worked. The infrastructure, the laws, the financial instruments, all of it felt as natural as breathing. They couldn't imagine commerce operating any other way. This economic engine powered not just individual fortunes, but the entire imperial project. Tax revenues flowed from prosperous provinces, funding armies, building monuments, supporting the vast bureaucracy that kept everything running smoothly. Trade and empire reinforced each other in an endless cycle of growth and expansion. Yet within this success lay the seeds of future challenges. Such a complex system required constant maintenance, careful management, political stability. When those elements began to falter, when the center could no longer hold, the entire magnificent structure would face its greatest test. Think about ancient Rhodes for a moment, this small Mediterranean island that somehow became the world's first insurance headquarters. Picture merchants from distant Britain sitting down with traders from Syria, and both of them insisting on Rhodian terms for their shipping contracts. This wasn't just respect, it was something deeper, a recognition that this little island had figured out how to turn risk into profit. The Rhodians understood something fundamental about human nature. The people will pay almost anything to sleep soundly at night. When your entire fortune was loaded onto wooden ships, crossing unpredictable seas, knowing that Rhodian law would protect your investment, that was worth its weight in gold. They had essentially invented what we might recognize today as maritime insurance. But they did it with nothing more than reputation, legal expertise, and an understanding of trust. Meanwhile, deep in the Spanish mountains near New Carthage, something equally remarkable was happening underground. The Romans had discovered silver deposits that would change the ancient world's entire monetary system. We're talking about mines that produced over 200 tons of silver every single year, enough to mint 50 million coins annually. To put that in perspective, that's more precious metal flowing out of the ground than some entire kingdoms would see in a generation. But this wasn't just about digging holes and hoping for the best. The Romans had turned mining into something approaching modern industrial engineering. They developed hydraulic systems that could blast away entire hillsides, created sophisticated drainage networks to keep underground tunnels dry, and organized labor forces that operated like clockwork. The human cost was staggering. 40,000 slaves, working in conditions that defied imagination. But the economic impact rippled across 3 continents. The silver from these Spanish mines didn't just sit in Roman treasuries, it flowed along trade routes that stretched from Britain to India, lubricating commerce in ways that seem almost magical today. A Roman coin minted from Spanish silver might end up in a merchant's purse in Alexandria, then travel with a spice trader to the ports of southern India, where it would buy goods destined for markets in Gaul. Speaking of spices, there's something almost dreamlike about the pepper trade that connected Rome to the distant shores of India. Black pepper was so precious that people literally used it as money. Imagine paying your rent with peppercorns, not as some quaint metaphor, but as actual legal tender. Roman merchants established permanent outposts in Indian harbors, creating a network of commerce that archaeologists are still uncovering today. Roman coins have been found as far east as Vietnam, silent witnesses to journeys that must have seemed like voyages to another world. The scale of these trading expeditions defies easy comprehension. A single cargo ship arriving in Alexandria from India could carry enough pepper, silk, and exotic spices to supply the entire Western Mediterranean for months. Think about that for a moment. One ship's hold containing goods that would satisfy the luxury cravings of millions of people across dozens of provinces. What made all of this possible was something that medieval Europe would struggle to recreate: a truly urban economy. While later civilizations would retreat into agricultural subsistence, Roman wealth concentrated itself in cities that functioned like enormous production centers. Take Antioch, with its 300,000 residents. This wasn't just a large town where people happened to live close together. It was a manufacturing powerhouse, producing textiles, metalwork, glassware, pottery, and luxury goods that found their way to markets across 3 continents. The urban populations weren't simply consumers waiting to buy things. They were creators, innovators, skilled craftspeople who turned raw materials into finished goods that commanded premium prices in distant markets. A glassmaker in Antioch might create vessels that would grace tables in Britain, while a textile worker's creations might end up adorning wealthy citizens in North Africa. All of this economic activity required a taxation system that was both sophisticated and ruthless. The Romans developed what was essentially franchise taxation, where private collectors called publicani would bid for the right to extract revenue from specific provinces. They paid the government up front, then kept whatever they could collect above that amount. It was capitalism applied to government finance, creating enormous incentives for efficiency and innovation in revenue collection. This system generated wealth on a scale that seems almost impossible today. Roman merchants lived better than European kings would live centuries later. The middle classes in major Roman cities enjoyed amenities that wouldn't reappear until the Industrial Revolution: running water, central heating, public entertainment, educational opportunities, and access to foods from across the known world. But every economic miracle rests on assumptions, and the Roman system depended on 3 critical foundations that seemed unshakable at the time. Political stability meant that contracts made today would still be honored years later. Military security ensured that trade routes remained open and predictable. Demographic growth created ever-expanding markets for goods and services. For over 2 centuries, these foundations held firm. The Pax Romana created conditions where a merchant could invest in a 3-year trading venture to India without losing sleep over political upheaval. Roman legions kept trade routes clear of bandits and rival powers. Growing urban populations provided ready markets for everything from British wool to Indian spices. Trade volumes grew steadily, cities expanded beyond anything the ancient world had previously imagined, and new technology spread rapidly across the empire. Wealth accumulated at rates that wouldn't be seen again for more than a millennium. The system seemed not just successful, but invincible, a perpetual motion machine of commerce and prosperity. Yet beneath this surface of unprecedented prosperity, subtle changes were already beginning. Economic engines, no matter how sophisticated, remain vulnerable to shifts in their underlying assumptions. While merchants calculated their profits and planned their next ventures, Forces were gathering that would test every assumption upon which this remarkable system had been built. The three pillars that supported Roman economic dominance, political stability, military security, and demographic growth would soon face challenges that no amount of commercial innovation could overcome. The very success of the system had created conditions that would, paradoxically, threaten its continued existence. Picture this moment, frozen in time. The year is 376, and something extraordinary is unfolding along the edges of what we now call Bulgaria. From the walls of a thriving Roman city, guards are staring at something that defies everything they thought they knew about the world. Stretching beyond the horizon, like an ocean of humanity, over 200,000 people are gathered with their belongings, their animals, their entire lives packed into wagons. But here's what makes this scene so remarkable. These aren't the wild, painted warriors that our movies love to show us. These are the Visigoths, and they've been Rome's neighbors for generations. Many of them have fought alongside Roman soldiers, bought and sold goods in Roman markets, and some have even earned Roman citizenship. Their king, Fritigern, speaks Latin as smoothly as any Roman senator. He spent years walking the marble halls of the imperial court, understanding the intricate dance of Roman politics. These people aren't here to attack, they're begging to be let in. They're refugees, fleeing from something so terrifying that they've abandoned their ancestral homes forever. What could possibly drive an entire nation to pack up everything they own and throw themselves on the mercy of their neighbors? The answer lies in a force that was reshaping the entire map of Europe. The Huns had arrived, and they weren't just another tribe looking for better grazing lands. They were something unprecedented, a migration phenomenon that modern historians compare to a natural disaster. Imagine entire civilizations moving across the steppes with a speed and coordination that left everyone else stunned. For centuries, Rome had been playing an incredibly sophisticated game along its northern borders. It was like conducting a massive orchestra, where Germanic tribes were kept busy fighting each other instead of threatening Rome. Roman gold flowed to friendly chiefs, keeping them loyal. The most ambitious young warriors from these tribes found glory and wealth serving in Roman armies. It was a delicate balance, maintained through diplomacy, bribery, intimidation, and careful integration. Then the Huns arrived, and this carefully crafted system shattered like glass under a hammer. Archaeological evidence tells us that over 40 different tribal groups were displaced across Eastern Europe in less than 50 years. Think about that for a moment. Entire peoples, numbering in the hundreds of thousands, falling like dominoes across the continent. This is where our popular understanding gets things completely wrong. We love stories of sudden violent eruptions, savage hordes appearing from nowhere to burn and pillage. The reality was far more complex, and in many ways far more devastating to the urban world that Rome had built. Take what happened in 410, when Rome itself was sacked by the Visigoth leader Alaric. Here's the twist that changes everything. Alaric wasn't some wild barbarian chief. He was a Roman general. Yes, a Roman general who had served the empire faithfully for years. He spoke Latin fluently, understood Roman law better than many Romans, and had commanded Roman legions in battle. His men weren't savage barbarians either. They were former Roman allies who had been systematically betrayed by a government that was rotting from within. They'd been underpaid, mistreated, and abandoned by the very empire they'd served. When Alaric finally marched on Rome, he tried 3 separate times to negotiate a peaceful settlement. He didn't want to destroy the Eternal City. He wanted payment for services rendered and land where his people could finally settle down. Only after months of Roman duplicity and broken promises did he finally order his troops through the gates. And even then, the sack was remarkably restrained by ancient standards. Churches were respected, civilians were largely spared, and many of Rome's greatest treasures were left completely untouched. But here's the crucial point that changes how we understand this entire period. Alaric's march on Rome wasn't the cause of urban decline. It was merely a symptom of something much deeper, much more systematic, that was already happening. The real damage to Roman cities wasn't occurring during these dramatic sieges that make such compelling stories. It was happening slowly, almost invisibly, in the daily breakdown of the economic and administrative systems that kept cities alive. The complex networks that brought grain from Egypt, wine from Gaul, and olive oil from Spain were fraying. The bureaucrats who maintained roads, aqueducts, and public buildings were disappearing. Cities are incredibly delicate organisms. They require constant feeding, constant maintenance, constant coordination between countless moving parts. When those systems begin to fail, the decline can be surprisingly rapid. A city that appears prosperous and thriving can find itself struggling within a generation. The barbarian migrations weren't destroying urban civilization so much as they were revealing how fragile it had already become. The Huns, by displacing so many tribes simultaneously, had overwhelmed Rome's ability to manage its borders through the old methods of diplomacy and selective integration. The system that had worked for centuries simply couldn't handle the scale and speed of what was happening. What we're really witnessing in this period isn't the triumph of barbarism over civilization. It's the painful transformation of one world into another, as the urban, centralized system that Rome had perfected gradually gave way to something completely different. The story of these migrations, these desperate refugees and displaced peoples, is ultimately a story about how civilizations adapt, change, and sometimes struggle to survive when the world around them shifts in ways they never anticipated. Picture walking through the streets of a bustling Roman city in the year 380. The air hums with activity. Merchants call out their wares, fountains splash in marble squares, and over 50,000 people make their lives within these walls. This is Augusta Emerita, what we now call Mérida in Spain, and it represents everything magnificent about Roman urban life. The buildings stretch toward the sky, with their red tile roofs. The markets overflow with goods from across the empire, and construction crews work on new projects that will outlast their grandchildren. Every street corner tells a story of prosperity. Every public building speaks of permanence. This is civilization at its peak. A testament to human achievement that has lasted for centuries. But time, as it always does, begins to work its quiet magic. 70 years drift by like leaves in autumn, and by 450, something remarkable has happened. The same streets that once buzzed with 50,000 voices now echo with fewer than 10,000. Entire neighborhoods stand empty, their windows dark, their doorways silent. What's fascinating is what didn't happen here. No great army came thundering through the gates. No dramatic siege brought down the walls in a blaze of glory. Instead, something far more subtle took place, something that reveals how fragile even the mightiest civilizations can be. Think of a city like a living organism, breathing through countless invisible channels. Trade routes pump lifeblood through its veins. Tax collection keeps its heart beating, and the surrounding countryside feeds it like a vast network of arteries. When those channels begin to close, one by one, the organism slowly begins to fade. The tax collectors arrive less frequently now, their journeys made dangerous by bandits and uncertain by the presence of new peoples in the countryside. The merchant caravans that once arrived with clockwork regularity now come sporadically, if at all. The rural estates that supplied the city's needs have new masters. People who operate by different rules, different expectations. In the year 406, something happened that changed everything, though few people at the time understood its true significance. Winter had gripped Europe in an unusually fierce embrace, freezing the Rhine River solid as stone. Across this icy bridge came a massive coalition of peoples, Vandals, Alans, and Suebi, flowing into Gaul like water through a broken dam. But here's what makes this story so intriguing. These weren't rampaging hordes bent on destruction. They were families, communities, entire societies looking for new homes. They didn't march straight to the great cities to tear them down. Instead, they scattered across the countryside, settling wherever they found fertile land and promising opportunities. For the farmers and rural folk, this might have simply meant new landlords, new faces in positions of authority. Many of these barbarian leaders were actually quite practical. They understood that successful agriculture meant prosperity for everyone. They wanted the land to remain productive, the harvests to continue. But for the cities, this peaceful settlement spelled a kind of slow doom. Urban life depends on a delicate dance between city and countryside, a relationship built over generations of mutual need and benefit. The rural areas provide food, raw materials, and tax revenue, while the cities offer manufactured goods, services, and administrative order. When the barbarian groups settled in the countryside and began operating outside the traditional Roman economic system, that dance began to stumble. Cities like Trier and Cologne found themselves slowly starving, not for lack of food exactly, but for lack of the economic connections that had sustained them for centuries. Imagine if tomorrow morning, all the farms around your city decided to stop participating in the modern economy. No more shipments to grocery stores, no more tax payments to fund public services, no more purchases of city-made products. How long would your urban infrastructure survive? How quickly would the lights begin to dim? The psychological impact cut just as deep as the economic one. Roman cities had always represented something greater than mere collections of buildings and people. They embodied the idea of civilization itself, of order triumphing over chaos, of human achievement lasting across generations. Citizens took genuine pride in their public forums, their civic ceremonies, their connection to an empire that seemed eternal. But as barbarian kingdoms established themselves within former Roman territory, as Roman administration became increasingly unreliable, as the great trade networks began to fragment, urban populations felt something precious slipping away. The future, which had once seemed as solid as marble columns, now appeared uncertain as morning mist. Here's where the story takes a particularly poignant turn. Archaeological evidence reveals that many barbarian leaders actually tried desperately to preserve Roman urban infrastructure. They weren't the destroyers of civilization that popular imagination sometimes makes them out to be. They were often its would-be protectors. Take Theodoric the Great, the Ostrogothic king who ruled Italy from 493 to 526. This man spent enormous resources maintaining Roman aqueducts, repairing public buildings, and keeping urban institutions functioning. His court historian tells us that Theodoric understood cities were the source of wealth and power, and he genuinely wanted to preserve that legacy. But Theodoric and leaders like him faced an almost impossible challenge. Roman cities required Roman-level resources to maintain, and the systems that had sustained urban life for centuries were incredibly complex and interdependent. Tax collection, trade networks, administrative structures, they all worked together like the gears of an intricate clock. Once those systems were disrupted, even the most well-intentioned barbarian kings found themselves trying to repair a mechanism they didn't fully understand. Imagine attempting to maintain a modern city's infrastructure, its water treatment plants, electrical grids, and telecommunications networks, after the collapse of the federal government and the breakdown of international trade. Some barbarian rulers succeeded, at least for a while. Ravenna remained magnificent under Ostrogothic rule well into the 6th century, its mosaics still glowing with imperial splendor. Toledo flourished as the capital of Visigothic Spain, its libraries and workshops continuing the work of civilization. But these were bright exceptions in a darkening landscape. The tragic irony runs deep through this entire story. Many barbarian leaders genuinely admired Roman civilization and saw themselves not as its destroyers, but as its inheritors. They dreamed of ruling over the same magnificent cities, the same prosperous territories, the same cultured populations that had made Rome great. But the very act of barbarian settlement, however peaceful their intentions, disrupted the delicate networks that Roman cities needed to survive. It was like trying to preserve a spider's web while walking through it. The destruction happened despite the best of intentions. What keeps historians awake at night is understanding how irreversible this process largely was. Once a Roman city lost its economic foundation, once its population dropped below the critical mass needed to maintain urban infrastructure, Once its connections to imperial trade networks were severed, rebuilding became extraordinarily difficult. Medieval Europe would eventually develop new forms of urban life, but it would take centuries of gradual recovery, and those new cities, when they finally emerged, would be fundamentally different creatures from their Roman predecessors. They would reflect new values, new economic realities, new ways of organizing human society. Yet even as this great transformation was reshaping the urban landscape of Europe, even as Germanic tribes were settling into their new homes and cities were adapting to changed circumstances, another crisis was developing. This one would strike at the very heart of the empire's ability to fund and maintain its vast urban civilization, threatening the foundation upon which everything else depended. Picture yourself holding a piece of ancient silver, cold and heavy in your hand. This small coin tells one of history's most devastating stories. Back in the days when Rome ruled the world, money meant something real. Silver coins carried weight, literally and figuratively. Merchants trusted them. Emperors stamped their faces on them, and ordinary people saved them for their children's future. But empires, like people, can make terrible mistakes that echo through generations. Around the 3rd century, Roman leaders faced a problem that would make modern politicians sweat. The treasury was empty, soldiers demanded their pay, and enemies pressed at every border. What happened next shows us how quickly trust can crumble, and how the mightiest civilizations can destroy themselves from within. Deep in the imperial mint at Rome, workers began doing something unthinkable. They melted down perfectly good silver coins, mixing them with cheaper metals like copper and tin. The new coins looked similar, carried the same imperial stamps, but contained far less precious metal. It was like watering down wine and hoping nobody would notice. Except everyone noticed, eventually. This process, called debasement, started small. Maybe 60% silver instead of 80%, then 50%, then 30%. Each emperor who inherited this mess faced the same impossible choice: print more worthless money or watch the empire collapse immediately. Most chose the first option, kicking the problem down the road like a can nobody wanted to deal with. The human stories behind these numbers break your heart. Archaeologists have found coins hidden in walls, buried under floors, stuffed into pottery jars throughout the former Roman territories. These weren't the hordes of wealthy merchants trying to get richer. They were the desperate savings of ordinary families, watching their life's work turn to worthless metal before their eyes. One particular collection, discovered in Turkey, contains nearly 250 coins spanning 70 years. Looking at them is like watching a slow-motion disaster. The early coins shine bright silver, beautifully crafted, clearly valuable. The later ones grow progressively duller, lighter, cheaper looking. You can literally see an empire's economic death in these small pieces of metal. Imagine watching your savings become worthless, not through war or natural disaster, but through your own government's decisions. Picture checking your wallet each morning, knowing the money inside bought less than it did yesterday. This wasn't inflation as we know it today. This was economic destruction on a scale that defies modern understanding. The mathematics of this collapse stagger the imagination. Silver content dropped from over 80% to barely 5% in less than a century. In today's terms, it would be like watching a $100 bill become worth $5 during your lifetime. But the real damage went far deeper than numbers on coins. Something called Gresham's Law kicked in with devastating efficiency. When people realized new coins contained less silver, they started hoarding the old valuable ones and spending only the worthless new money. Good silver vanished from circulation, while bad metal flooded every market. The psychological damage spread faster than any plague. Trust, once broken, proves nearly impossible to rebuild. Roman coins had been the backbone of Mediterranean trade for centuries. Merchants from Britain to Syria had accepted them without question. Suddenly, traders began demanding gold instead. Local markets reverted to bartering goods directly. The sophisticated monetary system that had built an empire was crumbling like old parchment. Daily life became a nightmare of constantly changing prices. A loaf of bread that cost half a coin in 260 became 50 coins by 280, then 200 coins by 300. Imagine trying to plan your household budget when prices doubled every few months. Imagine being paid in money that lost value between morning and evening. Cities suffered the worst damage because urban populations depended entirely on money to survive. Rural farmers could grow their own food, raise their own animals, build their own shelter. City dwellers needed to buy everything, and suddenly their money wouldn't buy anything. Urban civilization simply stopped working. Consider the city of Autumn in ancient Gaul. Around 250, it housed over 40,000 people in bustling prosperity. Markets thrived, construction projects rose everywhere, and life seemed good. Archaeological evidence shows active commerce, busy workshops, and all the signs of a healthy economy. But as currency collapsed, this urban paradise withered like a flower without water. Merchants stopped visiting because Roman money wouldn't cover their costs. Local craftsmen couldn't afford raw materials, as prices changed daily. Construction workers demanded payment in food rather than worthless coins. Within 30 years, Autumn's population had dropped to fewer than 15,000 people. Large sections simply emptied out, not because of foreign invasion or natural disaster, but because the economic foundation of city life had vanished. This pattern repeated across the empire, like a contagion spreading from town to town. Trade networks that had connected distant provinces broke down when nobody trusted the currency anymore. Specialization, the cornerstone of urban prosperity, became impossible when money couldn't reliably store value between transactions. The irony cuts deep when you think about it. Rome's leaders, trying to save their empire, ended up destroying the very thing that made their empire possible. The trust and economic stability that had lifted Roman civilization above all others crumbled under the weight of short-term thinking and impossible choices. This story reminds us that even the most powerful institutions rest on surprisingly fragile foundations. Trust, once lost, can take generations to rebuild. Economic stability, once shattered, leaves scars that last for centuries. The Romans, who buried their coins in walls and floors, understood something their leaders had forgotten. True wealth isn't just metal and paper, it's the faith that tomorrow will honor the promises we make today. Picture Rome at its breaking point, where emperors kept making the same terrible mistake over and over again. When the money ran out, they didn't fix the real problems. Instead, they just made more money, but cheaper money. Worthless money. Emperor Aurelian had a particularly clever, yet devastating idea. He took bronze coins, the cheap stuff, and coated them with a thin layer of silver. Imagine that for a moment. The most powerful empire in the world was basically counterfeiting its own currency. It's like painting fool's gold and hoping no one would notice. Then came Diocletian, who thought he could simply order inflation to stop. He declared official prices for everything and threatened to execute anyone who charged more. But here's the thing about economics. It doesn't care about imperial decrees. You might as well try to stop a river by shouting at it. Making inflation illegal is about as effective as making gravity illegal. Now, there's something really heartbreaking that happened during this chaos. Something that shows just how deeply this crisis cut into Roman society. For centuries, wealthy Romans had this beautiful tradition. They would fund public projects, build theaters, sponsor festivals, construct fountains and baths. And then, they'd put up stone inscriptions, little monuments to their generosity that would last forever. But suddenly, these inscriptions started disappearing. Not the old ones, those stayed carved in stone. The new ones just stopped appearing. Between the years 250 and 300, the number of these generous inscriptions dropped by more than 80%. Think about what that means. The wealthy people who had always taken care of their communities, who maintained the things that made city life worth living, they simply couldn't afford to anymore. When even the rich become poor, who's left to fix the fountains? Who's going to keep the public baths running? The theatres open, the festivals happening. The festivals happening. The very fabric of Roman urban life began unraveling, thread by thread. But perhaps the most catastrophic change was what happened to Rome's legendary military machine. Roman legions weren't just armies, they were like giant economic engines rolling across the frontier. A single legion, about 5,000 soldiers, had an annual payroll worth roughly 1.5 million denarii. That's an enormous amount of money flowing into frontier communities. These soldiers didn't just fight, they spent money. They bought food from local farmers, equipment from craftsmen, goods from merchants. They supported families, both their own and the families of everyone who sold them things. Military bases were like small cities built entirely around this steady flow of military wages. Then the currency collapsed, and suddenly, military pay became worthless. Imagine being asked to risk your life for money that couldn't buy you dinner. Recruitment became impossible. The professional legions that had defended Rome for centuries simply began falling apart. In their place came something entirely different. Barbarian federati, allied troops who demanded payment in land and goods instead of worthless coins. Do you see the terrible cycle forming here? Economic collapse weakened the military, which invited barbarian attacks, which increased military costs, which required more currency debasement, which caused more economic collapse. The archaeological evidence for this disaster is absolutely overwhelming. Across the empire, archaeologists have found coin hoards, thousands of them, over 2,000 in Britain alone. These represent the life savings of ordinary people who lost all faith in their government's money. They buried their coins and never came back for them. Villa excavations tell the same story. Suddenly, the production of luxury goods just stopped. Archaeological layers from this period are noticeably thinner, showing reduced economic activity and shrinking populations. Cities were literally getting smaller. Here's what makes this collapse so utterly tragic. It was completely preventable. Rome wasn't running out of silver. The Spanish mines were still producing plenty. The empire wasn't being crushed by military expenses that were beyond its capacity. The costs were manageable, if spread properly, across the tax base. The real problem was political chaos. Between 235 and 284 AD, a span of just 50 years, Rome had 26 different emperors, most of them died violent deaths. Imagine trying to plan for the future when the government changes every 2 years, usually through assassination. Each new emperor faced exactly the same impossible situation. Empty treasury, unpaid armies, political enemies, ready to pounce at the first sign of weakness, and each one reached for the same quick fix: currency debasement. Print more money now, worry about the consequences later. But those consequences were the death of Roman urban civilization itself. Once hyperinflation destroys people's trust in money, rebuilding that trust is incredibly difficult. Even when Diocletian finally managed to stabilize the currency in the early 300s, Roman cities never truly recovered. The middle class that had supported urban culture for centuries had been completely wiped out. The trade networks that had connected distant markets across the empire had fragmented into smaller, local systems. The economic confidence that had driven urban investment for generations was simply gone. Think about those buried coin hoards for a moment. Each one represents a family that lost everything. People who thought they were being prudent by saving money, only to discover that their money had become worthless paper, or in this case, worthless metal. This economic catastrophe was about to collide with an even more fundamental transformation, one that would completely reshape what it meant to be Roman. There was a moment in human history when the roads of an empire became filled with an entirely different kind of traveler. Picture the dusty highways that had once carried merchants laden with precious goods, soldiers marching toward distant battles, and officials conducting the business of power. Now these same pathways echoed with the footsteps of pilgrims, carrying nothing more than simple walking sticks, heading not toward the great cities, but away from them entirely. This wasn't just a change in who used the roads, it was a signal of something much deeper happening in the human soul. An entire way of thinking about what made life meaningful was quietly crumbling, while something completely new was being born in its place. Think about this for a moment. For nearly 1,000 years, people had believed that civilization meant one thing above all else: cities. If you wanted to live a proper, refined life, you gathered with others in places of marble and stone. You built theaters for entertainment, baths for luxury, forums for debate. Everything outside the city walls was considered rough, uncivilized, barely human. Yet suddenly, the most respected people in society were choosing to live in caves, sleep on straw, and embrace poverty as if it were treasure. The story of one man captures this transformation perfectly. Paulus lived exactly the kind of life that was supposed to represent success and happiness. He owned vast estates scattered across the known world, lived in a magnificent villa with heated floors and servants, held political connections that opened every door. In the year 380, if you had walked through his home in Bordeaux, you would have seen everything that wealth could buy. Marble imported from distant quarries, art collected from the finest workshops, gardens designed to display nature's beauty in perfect order. Then, 9 years later, he did something that left his entire social circle speechless. He gave it all away. Every villa, every estate, every comfortable luxury was sold, with the money flowing to those who had nothing. He and his wife packed their few remaining belongings and moved to a simple Christian community where their daily routine involved prayer, working with their hands, and caring for strangers who arrived seeking shelter. The man who could have commanded thousands chose instead to wash the feet of people whose names he would never know. To his former peers, this looked like madness, but Paulus wasn't alone in making this choice, and perhaps that's the most remarkable part of the story. All across the empire, wealthy families were walking away from urban life in numbers that had never been seen before. This wasn't the temporary retreat of people taking a vacation in the countryside. It was a permanent rejection of everything that cities represented. Between the year 350 and 450, the number of Christian monasteries in just one region grew from fewer than 20 to over 200. Each one represented a small community of people who had decided that the old way of living simply wasn't working anymore. But what were they building in place of the cities they left behind? Take the monastery of Lérens, established around the year 400 on a small island off the southern coast. Its founder, Honoratus, was yet another wealthy Roman who had abandoned urban privileges. But this wasn't a primitive camp of people hiding from the world. It was a sophisticated community that provided everything a traditional city offered, just organized around completely different principles. The island had workshops where craftsmen created beautiful objects and scribes copied precious manuscripts. It had libraries that preserved the wisdom of earlier generations, schools that educated children from both monastic and local families. There were hospitals for healing the sick, guest houses for welcoming travelers, gardens that fed the community. According to those who lived there, it was economically self-sufficient, intellectually rich, and socially diverse. In essence, it was a city, but a city built on cooperation instead of competition, spiritual wealth instead of material accumulation. And here's what makes this so fascinating. People weren't choosing this life because they were forced to, they were choosing it because urban life had begun to feel hollow and dangerous. Roman cities during this period were becoming increasingly violent places where economic stability was a distant memory and social divisions grew wider each year. The public amenities that had once made city life attractive, those beautiful baths, grand theaters, and bustling forums, were either falling into disrepair or becoming so expensive that ordinary people couldn't enjoy them. Meanwhile, these Christian communities offered something that traditional Roman society seemed unable to provide: genuine security, clear purpose, and real equality among people, regardless of their background. In a world where political involvement could get you killed, where barbarian raids were a constant threat, and where economic collapse was always around the corner, the monastery began to look less like an escape from civilizations and more like civilization's natural evolution. The roads were still busy, perhaps busier than they had ever been, but the traffic told a story of profound change in the human heart, a story about what happens when an entire culture begins to question its most basic assumptions about success, happiness, and the good life. The same highways that had once connected a commercial empire were now guiding people toward a completely different understanding of what it meant to be human and what it meant to live together in community. This wasn't just a religious movement. It was a psychological revolution that would reshape the entire structure of society for centuries to come. Picture, if you will, a world where everything your parents taught you about what mattered suddenly stopped mattering at all, where the very foundations of how people thought about success, honor, and the good life began to crumble like old stone. For hundreds of years, being Roman meant something very specific. It meant you belonged to a city, participated in its rhythms, attended its spectacles, you joined guilds with other craftsmen, cheered at the gladiator fights, donated money to build beautiful public buildings. Your identity came from these urban connections, these civic duties, these very tangible, very visible ways of being part of something larger. But then Christianity arrived, and it whispered a completely different story about what life could be. Instead of serving Caesar, you could serve God. Instead of thinking about this temporary world, you could focus on eternity. Instead of competing for status in the city square, you could find meaning in a community of believers. This wasn't just people changing religions, the way we might think about it today. This was like rewiring the entire operating system of Roman civilization. People's brains, quite literally, began to value different things, seek different rewards, organize their days around completely different principles. And then something remarkable happened in the year 400. In the northern city of Trier, this magnificent place that had been called the Rome of the North, barbarian raids were disrupting the countryside. Trade was failing. The imperial court had packed up and moved away to Ravenna. Now, traditionally, Romans would have responded to this crisis in predictable ways. Strengthen the walls, raise more taxes, recruit more soldiers, fight, defend, rebuild. But instead, something almost unthinkable occurred. People simply left. Not in panic, not as refugees fleeing for their lives. They made careful, deliberate choices to walk away from urban life entirely. Wealthy families donated their beautiful city homes to the church and moved to rural religious communities. Skilled craftsmen closed their workshops and joined monasteries, where they would use their talents for spiritual purposes rather than making money. By the year 420, Trier's population had collapsed from 80,000 people to fewer than 20,000. But here's the truly fascinating part. Many of the people who left weren't poor, weren't desperate, weren't forced out by circumstances. They were spiritual pioneers who had decided that city life itself was spiritually empty. This pattern began repeating across the empire like ripples, spreading across a pond. Antioch, once a glittering metropolis of 300,000 souls, watched massive numbers of its citizens flow outward to surrounding monasteries. Alexandria, that great intellectual capital where scholars had gathered for centuries, lost many of its brightest minds to Christian schools hidden away in the Egyptian desert. Even Rome itself, the eternal city, experienced what historians now call voluntary deurbanization. Wealthy Christians chose lives of simplicity over urban luxury, trading marble floors for monastery cells, trading dinner parties for prayer. But perhaps the most profound change was happening in how Romans thought about public space itself. For generations, wealthy citizens had competed to fund the most impressive public buildings: amphitheaters, bathhouses, forums, gymnasiums. These monuments were how you showed your status, how you left your mark on the world. Christianity taught something radically different. True honor, it said, came from helping the poor, not impressing the powerful. So instead of funding new entertainment venues, wealthy Christians began building hospitals, orphanages, places where pilgrims could rest safely. The physical landscape of Roman cities began to transform. Churches replaced temples, hospices replaced gymnasiums, Monastery gardens, quiet and contemplative, replaced ornamental forums designed to showcase wealth and power. Imagine living through such a complete transformation of everything your society valued. Watching an entire civilization decide that everything their ancestors had built for 1,000 years was somehow fundamentally wrong. The archaeological evidence tells this story in fragments of stone and pottery. Excavations across the former empire show the same haunting pattern. Traditional Roman public buildings slowly falling into disrepair, their roofs caving in, their walls cracking, while Christian structures receive fresh investment, new additions, careful maintenance. Villa sites show evidence of conversion to religious use. Urban workshops close their doors forever, while monastery writing rooms expand their operations, copying manuscripts by candlelight. But here's what makes this transformation so deeply moving. The Romans who chose monastic life weren't rejecting civilization, they weren't giving up on human achievement. In their minds, they were trying to save civilization from itself. Traditional Roman cities had become, in their view, morally corrupt places where the wealthy exploited the poor, where spiritual life withered, where people competed ruthlessly for meaningless honors. Monasteries represented an attempt to preserve what was truly valuable about Roman culture: the learning, the legal traditions, the technological skills, the administrative knowledge, while leaving behind what had become poisonous. And in many ways, this grand experiment succeeded beyond their wildest dreams. When the old Roman world became impossible to sustain, it was often these monasteries that kept the lights burning. They preserved the classical texts that would have otherwise vanished forever. They maintained agricultural techniques that fed communities. They provided schools, hospitals, and social services that governments could no longer deliver. In trying to save their souls, they ended up saving much of human knowledge itself. But this spiritual revolution was about to collide with forces even more powerful, changes that would literally reshape the physical landscape of Europe and make the old Roman world not just spiritually obsolete, but practically impossible to maintain. Picture, if you will, a stone highway stretching endlessly toward the horizon, its perfectly fitted blocks gleaming under the Mediterranean sun. This was the Via Appia in the year 200 AD, and it pulsed with the very heartbeat of empire. Merchant wagons creaked along its surface, their wheels spinning stories of distant lands through clouds of dust and commerce. But roads, you see, are living things in their own way. They breathe through their drainage systems, they age through countless footsteps, and they can die when neglected. The Romans understood this better than almost any civilization before or since. Every great road had its guardian, a curator viam, whose job was far more complex than you might imagine. These weren't simple road workers. They were master engineers, supervising armies of stonemasons who could split granite with surgical precision, carpenters who built bridges designed to carry the weight of history itself. The money flowing into road maintenance was astronomical. Historians estimate it consumed roughly 2% of the entire empire's annual revenue. To put that in perspective, imagine if a modern country spent that same proportion today. The numbers would make your head spin. But here's where the story takes a darker turn. By 450 AD, that same magnificent Via Appia told a completely different tale. Weeds pushed through cracks in the stone, like nature reclaiming what humans had dared to tame. Bridges lay in scattered pieces at the bottom of rivers, their engineering secrets lost to time and neglect. The transformation didn't happen overnight, of course. It was gradual, like watching a strong person slowly weaken from illness. First came the missed repairs, small cracks that should have been sealed before winter. Then the drainage systems clogged with debris, allowing water to seep beneath the foundation stones. When the Roman tax system began to crumble, the roads felt it immediately. Provincial governors stopped sending their tribute to Rome, and Rome stopped sending maintenance crews to the provinces. It was a perfect circle of decline, each part depending on the other. Think about the thousands of people whose livelihoods depended on these roads. the way station keepers who provided fresh horses and hot meals to travelers, the bridge toll collectors who knew every merchant by name, the specialized teams who understood exactly which type of stone worked best for repairs in mountain passes versus coastal plains. As the roads deteriorated, commerce slowed to a trickle. Cities that had thrived on trade found themselves isolated, cut off from the economic bloodstream that had nourished them for centuries. It's remarkable how quickly civilization can retreat when its infrastructure fails. The Roman road network had been more than just transportation. It was communication, economics, and imperial control, all rolled into perfectly engineered stone pathways. When those pathways cracked, the empire itself began to fracture along the same lines. Bandits moved into the abandoned way stations, turning what had once been safe havens into dangerous traps. Travelers who once moved freely across continents now huddled in local communities, afraid to venture beyond familiar boundaries. Perhaps the most haunting aspect of this collapse was how thoroughly the knowledge disappeared. The techniques for quarrying the perfect roadstone, the mathematical formulas for calculating drainage angles, the organizational systems for coordinating massive maintenance projects across thousands of miles, all of it simply vanished. Later generations would walk past the ruins of Roman roads and wonder how such marvels had been created. They had the stones right there in front of them, but the wisdom to maintain them had evaporated like morning mist. Some roads survived longer than others, of course. The major arteries closer to Rome kept functioning for decades after the outlying routes had been abandoned, but even these eventually succumbed to the same inexorable process of decay. What strikes me most about this story is how it reveals the hidden fragility of our greatest achievements. The Romans built their roads to last forever, using techniques so sophisticated that modern engineers still study them with admiration. Yet without constant care and attention, even these monuments to human ingenuity became nothing more than scattered stones and forgotten dreams. The collapse of Roman roads teaches us something profound about civilizations themselves. They're not permanent structures that, once built, endure automatically. They're living systems that require constant nourishment, attention, and renewal. When that care stops flowing, decline becomes inevitable, no matter how impressive the original construction might have been. The empire had this clever system worked out for keeping roads in perfect condition. Picture it like a well-oiled machine, where local communities handled the small stuff, patching holes here and there, sweeping away debris. Meanwhile, the big imperial engineers swooped in for major projects, bringing their expertise and funding from Rome's vast treasury. It was actually quite brilliant, when you think about it, but like so many things in life, what seemed unshakable slowly began to crumble. By the 4th century, everything was going sideways. Those barbarian groups weren't just fighting, they were settling down in Roman territory, making it nearly impossible to collect taxes. You can imagine the frustration, trying to fund road repairs when your tax collectors can't even reach half the towns they're supposed to visit. Economic troubles were piling up too, the kind that make governments tighten their belts and cut spending on what they think are less essential things. And then there was the political chaos, leaders changing so frequently that nobody could make long-term plans. How do you plan a major highway project when you don't know if your government will still exist next year? Here's where the story gets heartbreaking. Once the Romans stopped maintaining their roads, decay happened faster than anyone expected. Take the Via Domitia, this magnificent highway that connected Italy all the way to Spain, weaving through southern Gaul like a ribbon of civilization. For over 400 years, this road had been the empire's faithful servant, built back in 118 BC when Rome was still young and ambitious. Archaeological work shows us this road was still in excellent shape as late as 350 AD. There's evidence of recent repairs, signs of heavy traffic, everything you'd expect from a vital imperial artery. But then silence. The maintenance crews stopped coming, the engineers moved on to other concerns, and nature began reclaiming what humans had built. Without anyone clearing the drainage ditches, debris started piling up. Water had nowhere to go, so it pooled on the road surface, seeping into cracks and freezing during winter, splitting stones apart. Bit by bit, Heavy wagons kept rolling over these damaged sections, creating deep ruts that made travel uncomfortable and dangerous. The bridges, those marvels of Roman engineering, began suffering too. Winter floods that had once been manageable started washing away supports that nobody was repairing anymore. By 450 AD, barely a century later, large stretches of this once magnificent highway were completely unusable. It's like imagining your local highway system without any government funding, no professional engineers, no organized repair crews. That's exactly what happened to roads that had once connected 3 continents. The human cost was staggering in ways that go beyond simple inconvenience. Roman cities had been designed with a fundamental assumption that transportation would always be reliable and fast. Urban populations, sometimes numbering in the hundreds of thousands, depended entirely on food shipments from agricultural regions that might be hundreds of miles away. Craftsmen in the cities relied on raw materials from specialized suppliers scattered across the empire. Merchants built their entire business models around predictable travel times and safe passage for valuable goods. When roads became unreliable, these urban systems began failing like dominoes. Let's look at Lugdunum, what we call Lyon today in France. This city had become incredibly prosperous as a transportation hub, sitting right where roads from Britain, Germany, Spain, and Italy all came together. Picture the bustling energy of this place, merchants arriving daily from across the known world, exchanging goods, making deals, redistributing cargo to its final destinations. But as road conditions got worse, those long-distance merchants stopped showing up. Why would they risk valuable cargo on routes that had become dangerous and unpredictable? Instead of these grand imperial trade networks, commerce fragmented into much smaller, local systems. People started trading only with their immediate neighbors, the way humans had done for thousands of years before Rome changed everything. Archaeological evidence tells us a fascinating story about Lugdunum's famous pottery workshops. These craftsmen had been exporting their beautiful work across all of Gaul, their products reaching dinner tables from the Atlantic to the Rhine. Then suddenly, around 420 AD, production just stopped. Not because people stopped wanting pottery, but because transportation had become so unreliable that it wasn't worth trying to ship anything far away. The city's population, which had peaked at over 50,000 people, dropped to fewer than 10,000 by 500 AD. This wasn't destruction from war or plague. This was something more subtle and perhaps more tragic. The city died from transportation failure, slowly strangling as its connections to the wider world were cut one by one. There's something deeply symbolic about what happened to the milestones. Roman roads had been marked every Roman mile, roughly 9 of our modern miles, with stone markers showing distances to major cities. These weren't just practical tools for travelers. They were symbols of imperial power, proof that Rome's authority extended across vast distances and could measure every step of it. But as road maintenance stopped, nobody bothered erecting new milestones. Even worse, existing ones were often torn down and used as building materials for local projects. People were literally dismantling the markers that had once connected them to the wider world, recycling them into walls and foundations for purely local needs. Archaeological evidence shows milestone production dropping dramatically after 350 AD. It's as if the empire was losing track of where it was going, both literally and metaphorically. The collapse devastated information flow too, something we might not think about but was absolutely crucial for holding an empire together. The Romans had created the cursus public, one of the ancient world's most sophisticated communication networks. Imperial messengers riding along well-maintained roads could carry urgent dispatches from York in northern Britain all the way to Rome in just 40 days. That's a speed Europe wouldn't see again until the 1700s. This system depended entirely on perfect roads and strategically placed way stations where messengers could change horses, grab supplies, and rest. As roads deteriorated and stations were abandoned, communication times increased dramatically. A message that took 40 days in 250 AD might take 80 or even 100 days by 450 AD, assuming it arrived at all. Think about what this meant for actually running an empire. How do you govern distant provinces when your orders take months to reach governors? How do you coordinate military responses when generals can't communicate with each other reliably? How do you collect taxes when you can't even send collectors to remote areas with any confidence they'll make it there and back? The road collapse transformed European geography in ways we can still see today. Roman roads had connected regions that made economic sense, but weren't necessarily geographically obvious. The Great Highway from Cologne to Milan, for instance, crossed the Alps through carefully engineered passes that made year-round travel possible. When these mountain roads lost their maintenance, alpine passes became impassable during winter months. Trade routes that had connected northern and southern Europe for centuries simply disappeared. Regional economies that had been integrated for hundreds of years suddenly found themselves isolated. Europe began fragmenting into the smaller, more localized units that would define medieval geography for the next 1,000 years. Perhaps most tragically, the knowledge of Roman road building itself largely disappeared. These weren't just construction techniques, they were sophisticated engineering systems that had taken centuries to develop and perfect. The Romans had figured out how to build roads that could carry heavy traffic for hundreds of years with minimal maintenance, using carefully layered materials and precise grading that worked with natural drainage patterns. When the institutional framework for maintaining roads collapsed, all that expertise went with it. Medieval European roads wouldn't match Roman engineering standards until the 1700s. In many ways, Europe didn't really recover from the Roman road collapse until railroads were invented, creating new networks that could finally move goods and people with something approaching Roman efficiency. But road collapse was just one piece of a much larger infrastructure crisis that was making Roman cities increasingly impossible to maintain. While engineers struggled desperately to keep highways passable, an even more fundamental challenge was emerging, one that would strike at the very foundation of what made urban life possible in the first place. Picture a world where the greatest cities that had stood for centuries suddenly became places of unimaginable terror. This is what happened when an invisible killer arrived in the Mediterranean, changing everything people thought they knew about safety and civilization. In the year 541, something microscopic began its journey across the Roman world. It traveled quietly, hidden in the fur of black rats, carried by tiny fleas that no one paid attention to. These creatures had found a perfect transportation system. The very trade routes that had made the empire prosperous. The plague, as history would remember it, didn't announce itself with armies or trumpets. It simply began killing people, one by one, then dozens, then thousands. And it chose its victims in the most densely packed places, the great cities that represented the pinnacle of human achievement. Constantinople stood as the crown jewel of what remained of the Roman Empire. Over 500,000 souls called this magnificent city home. The Hagia Sophia rose majestically above streets that buzzed with merchants, craftsmen, and families going about their daily lives. For more than 2 centuries, this place had been a symbol of human triumph over chaos. Then came that summer of 542. Morning would arrive with its usual sounds, children's laughter, the calls of vendors setting up their stalls. But as the sun climbed higher, something changed. People began collapsing in the markets. Families started carrying bodies from their homes. By evening, the city that had hummed with life now echoed with the creaking wheels of death carts. A historian named Procopius witnessed these events firsthand. His accounts tell us that at the plague's worst moment, Constantinople was losing 10,000 people every single day. In a city of 500,000, that meant 1 person in 50 was dying daily. The mathematics of this catastrophe are almost impossible to grasp, but this wasn't random destruction. The plague was systematically dismantling everything that made urban life work. It struck at the very heart of civilization itself, revealing how the Romans' greatest strengths could become their most dangerous weaknesses. Those grain ships that arrived regularly from Egypt, carrying about 175,000 tons of food each year, had become vessels of doom. The same trade networks that fed the empire's cities were now delivering death with clockwork precision. The rats that lived in ship holds, the fleas that lived on the rats, the grain that attracted the rats, all of this formed a perfect chain of destruction. In the city of Antioch, a lawyer named Evagrius Scholasticus watched his entire world collapse. His wife died, then his daughter, then his grandchildren. Most of his friends vanished within weeks, but what haunted him most wasn't just personal loss. It was watching the complete breakdown of everything that made his city function. Courts closed because there weren't enough judges left breathing. Markets fell silent because the merchants had either died or fled to the countryside. Construction projects froze mid-build because entire guilds of craftsmen had been wiped from existence. The city government simply stopped working because most officials had either perished or abandoned their duties. Modern researchers estimate this plague killed between 25 and 40% of the population in affected areas. To understand what this means, imagine nearly half the people in your neighborhood disappearing within months. This wasn't just a health crisis, it was the complete unraveling of society itself. The tragedy extended far beyond the immediate deaths. For over 1,000 years, Romans had believed cities offered safety that the countryside couldn't provide. Cities had thick walls to keep enemies out, massive granaries to survive famines, and skilled doctors to heal the sick. Urban life represented civilization's victory over nature's chaos. But the plague shattered this fundamental belief. Dense populations, once seen as a source of strength and culture, suddenly became death traps. A peasant living on an isolated farm might survive simply because distance protected him from infection. But a family crammed into a Roman apartment building, sharing common spaces with hundreds of neighbors, found themselves trapped in what amounted to a killing field. This realization transformed how people thought about cities forever. Before the plague, urban centers were celebrated as monuments to human achievement, proof that people could build something greater than the sum of their parts. After the plague, cities were often viewed with suspicion and fear, as dangerous concentrations that invited divine punishment. This wasn't superstition, it was bitter experience speaking. The plague didn't strike once and vanish like most disasters. It returned in waves, roughly every 8 to 12 years for the next 2 centuries, and each time it hit urban areas the hardest, reinforcing the lesson that crowded places were vulnerable places. Constantinople, that great city, suffered major outbreaks again and again. The years 558, 573, 586, 599, 618, and 698 all brought fresh waves of death. Each outbreak reminded survivors that their magnificent city, with all its walls and wealth and wisdom, couldn't protect them from an enemy too small to see. The psychological impact rippled through generations. Literary sources from this period show a complete transformation in how people understood urban life. What had once been humanity's greatest achievement now carried the constant threat of becoming humanity's greatest vulnerability. The very connectedness that had made Roman cities prosperous, those trade routes and crowded markets and bustling neighborhoods, had become pathways for destruction. 8 devastating plagues swept through the Mediterranean in just 200 years, ending in 747. Picture yourself trying to run a city under those conditions. Every few years, half your neighbors might simply disappear. The baker who made your bread, gone. The craftsman who fixed your roof, vanished. Entire streets empty, weeds growing through cobblestones that once echoed with footsteps. This wasn't just about death counts, though. Those were staggering enough. It was about the slow unraveling of everything that made civilization work. When you don't know if your population will exist next decade, why bother planning anything grand? Why start building a cathedral that might stand empty before it's finished? Imagine being a master craftsman, watching your apprentices die one by one. You've spent decades learning secrets passed down through generations of your family, the perfect mixture for glass that won't crack, the precise timing for firing pottery, the special knots that make nets strong enough for deep-sea fishing. All of that knowledge, living only in human memory, disappearing forever when the last person who knew it took their final breath. Carthage tells this story perfectly. Before the plague arrived, it was magnificent. Over 100,000 people called it home. The harbour bustled with ships carrying grain across the Mediterranean. Markets overflowed with goods from Africa's interior. Public buildings rose toward the sky, monuments to human ambition and engineering skill. Then 542 came, and with it, death on a scale no one had imagined. The first wave alone killed 4 out of every 10 people in the city. But that was just the beginning. More waves followed, each one preventing any real recovery. 558 brought another die-off. 573, another. 599, yet another. By the time Arab armies reached North Africa in 650, they found a ghost of the great city. 20,000 people wandered streets built for 5 times that many. 80% of the population simply gone. Not moved elsewhere, not hiding in the countryside. Gone. The economics of it all created a deadly spiral. Cities had always worked because enough people lived close together to support specialists. One person could spend their entire life just making shoes, because thousands of other people needed shoes and could trade food, cloth, or services for them. Another could focus entirely on copying books, because enough people wanted books to make it worthwhile. But when plague cut populations below certain thresholds, specialization became impossible. Why learn glassmaking when there might not be enough customers left alive to buy your windows? Why train as a doctor when half your patients will die anyway, and the other half might not survive long enough to pay you? Glass workshops across the former empire show the same heartbreaking pattern. Archaeologists find evidence of busy production, furnaces burning hot, craftsmen shaping molten material into beautiful forms. Then suddenly, abandonment, tools left where they fell. Half-finished pieces still sitting in cooling ovens. Silence that would last for centuries. Europe wouldn't match Roman glass quality again until after the year 1000. 500 years of lost knowledge vanished in a single generation of death. Schools closed when teachers died faster than new ones could be trained. Libraries emptied when no one remained who could read the scrolls. Hospitals became morgues, then stood abandoned. The infrastructure of learning and culture, built up over centuries, crumbled in decades. Perhaps saddest of all, cities lost their magnetic pull on young people. For generations, ambitious countryfolk had streamed into urban areas, drawn by opportunities for education, advancement, and excitement. This constant flow of fresh blood had kept cities alive despite their dangers. But plague turned cities into symbols of death rather than opportunity. Picture a healthy young farmer looking toward the distant walls of a city that had once seemed full of promise. Now those walls looked like a trap. Why leave a safe village for a place where invisible death lurked around every corner? The Great Migration from farm to city, which had powered Roman civilization for centuries, simply stopped. Young people stayed home. Cities aged, withered, and shrank. Professor Peter Sarris calculated something remarkable. Urban populations didn't return to pre-plague levels until the 11th century. 500 years of demographic shadows. 5 centuries of cities that were pale echoes of their former selves. But the deepest change wasn't in population numbers, it was in how people thought about the future itself. Roman culture had been built on confidence in human progress. They believed in building things to last forever. They planned great projects spanning generations. They trusted in technology, institutions, and the power of human civilization to overcome any challenge. Plague shattered that optimism, like glass hitting stone. Survivors developed what we might call a darker worldview. If death could come so suddenly, so completely, so randomly, what was the point of earthly ambition? Why build monuments when they might stand empty next year? Why pursue worldly success when the world itself seemed to be ending? Religious writings from this period show the change clearly. Instead of celebrating human achievement, they focused on preparing for apocalypse. Instead of investing in infrastructure, people donated to monasteries. Instead of planning for prosperity, they planned for salvation. This shift in thinking helps explain why Christianity found such fertile ground during these dark centuries. When earthly life became unpredictable and frightening, otherworldly promises became more appealing. When human institutions kept failing, divine ones seemed more reliable. The plague didn't just kill people and empty cities. It killed a certain kind of optimism about what humans could accomplish together. It replaced confidence with fatalism, ambition with resignation, hope with fear. Yet even as the Mediterranean world struggled through these repeated catastrophes, even as the lights went out in city after city, new forces were stirring. Different peoples, different ideas, different ways of organizing society were emerging from the chaos. The old world was dying, but something new was being born in its ashes. Here's something that might surprise you about the fall of Rome. While everyone was watching the great cities crumble, something completely unexpected was quietly taking shape in the forgotten corners of the countryside. Picture yourself walking through rural France in the year 500. The Roman roads are cracking, weeds growing through the ancient stones. But if you look closer, you'll notice something interesting. The farms are bustling with activity. New wooden halls are rising where marble villas once stood. People are working the land with a kind of energy that the old Roman estates never had. This wasn't decline. This was transformation, happening right under everyone's nose. The word feudalism gets thrown around a lot. But here's the thing. Nobody woke up one morning and decided to invent feudalism. It just sort of happened. Like water finding its way around a rock, people found ways to organize their lives when the old systems stopped working. Imagine being that merchant in Bordeaux, watching your world change. Your grandfather had imported olive oil from Spain, wool from Britain. Your father had somehow kept the business going, despite all the raids and the worthless coins. But now, standing in your empty shop, you're facing a choice your ancestors never could have imagined. There's this Visigothic lord, Euric, and he's making you an offer. Safe passage for your goods. Access to food from his farms. All you have to do is leave the city behind. Move to his stronghold in the countryside. Swear loyalty to him instead of some emperor who's probably never heard your name. What's remarkable is how many people said yes to offers like this. They weren't giving up. They were adapting, finding new ways to build security in an uncertain world. The genius of what emerged was its simplicity. Roman government needed massive bureaucracies, professional armies, complex supply chains stretching across continents. The new system, it worked on a human scale. A lord provided land and protection. His followers provided service and loyalty. Sacred oaths bound them together, creating relationships that mattered more than any law written in some distant capital. These weren't just business deals. They were personal bonds, almost like family ties. A lord who failed to protect his people would lose their loyalty. A vassal who broke his oath would lose everything. Trust became the currency that held society together. Archaeological evidence tells us something fascinating about this period. Those grand Roman villas scattered across the countryside, they didn't just disappear. Many were transformed into something entirely new. Fortified centers surrounded by thriving villages. Agricultural workshops producing everything from grain to metalwork. Gregory of Tours, writing in the 6th century, visited one such estate. A Frankish lord named Rausing had taken over an old Roman villa and turned it into something like a small kingdom. Grain fields stretched to the horizon. Vineyards produced wine. Workshops crafted textiles and pottery. The community was almost completely self-sufficient. This is what's so extraordinary. For centuries, people had believed that civilization meant cities. That culture, prosperity, security, all depended on urban life. But here, in the countryside, communities were proving that assumption wrong. Agricultural production often increased under these new arrangements. Lords had personal stakes in their land's success. Unlike distant Roman landowners who might never visit their estates, feudal lords lived among their fields and knew every acre personally. The psychology behind this shift runs deep. Roman status had come from civic participation, holding political office, sponsoring public buildings, competing for recognition in the forum. Your worth was measured by how well you played the urban game. Feudal society created entirely different measures of human value. A lord's power came from the warriors who'd sworn loyalty to him. His wealth flowed from his own land's productivity. His reputation rested on keeping his word, protecting those who depended on him. Personal relationships replaced institutional authority. Individual character mattered more than official titles. The ability to inspire loyalty became more valuable than the ability to navigate bureaucracy. In many ways, this was a more human scale of organization. Instead of being small parts in a vast imperial machine, people became essential members of communities where everyone knew everyone else. Their contributions were visible. Their security depended on relationships they could see and touch. The transformation wasn't planned or coordinated. It emerged organically as millions of individuals made practical choices about how to survive and thrive. Village by village, valley by valley, a new form of civilization took root. This wasn't the end of European culture, it was the beginning of something different. Something that would shape the continent for the next 1,000 years. Cities would eventually return, but they would rise in a world that had learned it could prosper without them. The countryside had taught Europe a lesson about resilience, about finding strength in simplicity, about building societies on human bonds rather than institutional authority. It was a lesson that would echo through the centuries, shaping everything from medieval kingdoms to modern democracies. The year was 507, and King Clovis stood victorious over the Visigothic kingdom of Toulouse. The Battle of Vouillers had ended. But what happened next would change everything. Instead of claiming the city and running it the Roman way, Clovis made a choice that seemed almost unthinkable at the time. He gave the land away. Not to governors or administrators, but to his Frankish warriors, piece by piece. Each soldier received enough territory to support his family, his followers, and his dreams of independence. The Chronicle of Fredegar tells us that these weren't small plots either. These were substantial holdings, enough for a man to build something entirely his own. And build they did. Fortified farmhouses began appearing across the countryside, sturdy structures that served as both home and fortress. The warriors recruited local peasants, taught them new ways of working, and created communities that could provide for themselves completely. No longer did they need to depend on the distant city for anything. Within just one generation, Toulouse began to fade. Not disappear entirely, mind you. The city still held its religious importance. People still gathered there for worship and ceremony. But as an economic center, as a place where goods flowed and fortunes were made, Toulouse was essentially finished. Think about it from the perspective of these new landowners. Why would you travel dangerous roads to an expensive city just to buy something you could make right at home? Your estate had everything: fertile fields, skilled hands, and most importantly, safety behind those fortified walls. The archaeological evidence paints a fascinating picture. Across what used to be Roman territories, excavations revealed the same story, over and over. New fortified sites rising from the earth, what scholars call modern Bailey castles, surrounded by thriving agricultural settlements. These weren't temporary camps thrown up in times of trouble. They were permanent statements, declarations that urban civilization was no longer necessary. Professor Thomas Bisson from Harvard spent years counting these sites, and his numbers are remarkable. Over 10,000 feudal strongholds were built across Western Europe between 450 and 750 AD. Each one represented someone making a conscious choice to leave the Roman system behind and create something completely different. But the transformation went deeper than just where people lived. It changed how Europeans thought about power itself. Roman authority had flowed through institutions, complex hierarchies where emperors commanded, because of their position in an elaborate governmental system. Officials implemented policies across vast territories, often without ever meeting the people they governed. Feudal power worked differently, entirely. It was personal, intimate, built on individual relationships and face-to-face promises. Lords commanded obedience not because of some distant office, but because of oaths, sworn and mutual obligations, freely accepted. When a vassal knelt before his lord, he wasn't submitting to an institution, he was entering into a personal contract with someone who knew his name. This shift had enormous implications for how society organized itself. Roman cities had been run by professional bureaucrats, men trained in law and administration, who could govern strangers according to written codes. But feudal territories were managed through personal negotiation, conversations between people who had shared meals together, who knew each other's families, who understood each other's needs and capabilities. The economic changes were equally revolutionary. Roman trade had thrived on specialization, with different regions producing different goods that traveled vast distances through monetary exchange. Coins passed from hand to hand, connecting distant markets and enabling complex transactions between people who never met. But feudal estates aimed for something entirely different: complete self-sufficiency. Why depend on distant strangers when your own community could provide everything you needed? Local production replaced long-distance trade, and payment in goods and services replaced monetary exchange. Consider what this meant for the skilled artisans who had once thrived in Roman cities. Why would a feudal lord pay expensive city craftsmen when he could train his own peasants to produce everything his community required? Why buy goods in urban markets when his estates could supply food, textiles, tools and weapons of equal quality? Historian Henry Penn called this the closed economy, regional systems that turned inward, providing for their own needs without depending on external trade. It was the complete opposite of the integrated interdependent economy that had once sustained Roman cities, where every community specialized in what it did best and traded for everything else. The transformation was so complete that money itself began to disappear from many areas. Feudal communities often operated without coins entirely, using barter systems where a day's work might be paid with a bushel of grain, or a horseshoe traded for a loaf of bread. Archaeological sites from this period showed dramatic reductions in coin finds, not because people had become poorer, but because they simply didn't need money anymore. By 600 AD, something remarkable had happened. Large areas of Western Europe had essentially returned to pre-Roman social organization, small-scale agricultural communities led by warrior elites, with minimal dependence on urban centers or long-distance trade. It was as if 1,000 years of Roman urban civilization had simply been reset, like turning back the hands of an enormous clock. The great cities still stood, their walls and monuments testament to imperial glory, but the life had gone out of them, flowing instead into countless small communities scattered across the countryside, each one a world unto itself, each one proof that sometimes the most profound changes happen not through conquest or catastrophe, but through the simple human desire to build something new. Picture a world where everything you've known about trade and commerce suddenly shifts, like the ground moving beneath your feet. Around the year 622, something extraordinary began in the scorching desert city of Mecca. A merchant named Muhammad started a journey that would change how entire continents did business together. Most people think of what happened next as just another conquest, but it was so much more than that. When Islamic armies swept across vast territories, they weren't simply taking over land like other conquerors before them. They were creating something entirely new, a massive commercial network that connected Spain all the way to India under one unified system. Now imagine being a merchant in Alexandria, around 640, watching unfamiliar armies approach your city walls. You might assume these are just more raiders, similar to the Germanic tribes that had been causing trouble for decades. But you'd be witnessing something completely different, the beginning of a commercial revolution that would reshape 3 continents. Within a single century, This new Islamic empire had grown to cover an area larger than anything the world had ever seen. But here's what made it truly remarkable. Instead of just looting and leaving like previous invaders, these conquerors built lasting institutions. They created unified legal systems, established consistent currencies, and developed trade networks that made doing business across vast distances easier than ever before. The changes weren't immediately obvious to everyone. Take something as simple as papyrus, the ancient equivalent of paper. For over 1,000 years, this writing material had flowed steadily from Egypt to European monasteries, royal courts, and merchant houses. Everyone depended on those regular shipments to keep records and conduct daily business. When Arab forces took control of Egypt in 641, they didn't shut down papyrus production. In fact, research shows they actually increased it. But here's where things get interesting. They redirected where it went. Instead of shipping north to European markets, Egyptian papyrus began flowing east to the growing cities of Baghdad and Damascus. European institutions suddenly found themselves unable to get the writing material they'd used for centuries. They had to switch to parchment made from animal skins, which could cost 10 times as much. For monasteries and towns already struggling economically, this price increase was devastating. Imagine your office supply costs suddenly multiplying by 10. That's what these communities faced. But papyrus was just the beginning. The same pattern repeated itself across dozens of different goods and materials. Take spices, which weren't just exotic luxuries back then. Pepper, cinnamon, and cloves were essential for preserving food, making medicines, and conducting religious ceremonies. For centuries, these precious goods had traveled from India and Southeast Asia through complex networks of middlemen before reaching European markets. European cities had built their wealth on importing these spices and redistributing them throughout the continent. The Islamic expansion changed all of that by creating more direct routes between the Middle East and Asia. Arab merchants established new trading posts in Indian Ocean ports. They developed relationships directly with producers in distant lands. They created credit systems that made long-distance commerce more reliable and efficient than anyone had managed before. This led to what scholars call the Great Commercial Reorientation. Instead of Asian goods flowing north through the Mediterranean to European cities, they began traveling east through the Red Sea to Cairo, then overland to the thriving Islamic centers of Damascus and Baghdad. Think about this from a business perspective. If you were an Indian pepper merchant, would you sell to struggling European towns or to prosperous Islamic cities that offered better prices, more reliable payments, and safer transportation routes? The choice was obvious. European cities that had prospered for centuries by importing and redistributing Asian goods suddenly found themselves completely bypassed. It was like being cut off from the internet in today's connected world. Consider what happened to Marseille, one of the Mediterranean's greatest ports for over 600 years. Ships from across the known world had docked there, loading wine, olive oil, and manufactured goods for export. In return, the city imported luxury items from Asia, Africa, and distant parts of the Mediterranean. Archaeological evidence tells us a dramatic story. Pottery fragments from distant regions, which had been common in earlier periods, virtually disappear from the archaeological record in the 7th century. Construction projects, which indicate prosperity and growth, decreased dramatically. The city's population, which may have reached 50,000 at its height, probably shrank to fewer than 5,000 by the year 700. This wasn't just about one city declining. It represented a fundamental shift in how the world's economy was organized. Trade routes that had existed for over a millennium suddenly became irrelevant. Cities that had thrived as middlemen in global commerce found themselves isolated from the new networks of prosperity. The transformation happened gradually, then suddenly. One generation of merchants might have noticed that certain goods were becoming harder to obtain. The next generation discovered that entire categories of trade had moved elsewhere. By the third generation, young people were growing up in cities that had lost their connection to the wider world entirely. What makes this story so fascinating is how it shows us that economic systems we think are permanent can actually shift quite rapidly. The Roman trade networks had seemed eternal, lasting for over 1,000 years, but when new players created better alternatives, those ancient systems became obsolete almost overnight. The Islamic commercial revolution didn't destroy Mediterranean trade, it simply redirected it along new paths that bypassed the struggling remnants of Roman urban civilization. For European cities already weakened by political instability and agricultural changes, losing access to global trade networks was often the final blow that pushed them from decline into complete transformation. Marseille found itself clinging to life as a small fishing port, its grand days as a trading giant now just a memory. The bustling merchants, the crowded harbours, the wealth flowing through its streets, all of that had simply melted away. What remained was something much quieter, much smaller, a shadow of what once was. But here's where the story takes a fascinating turn. While European cities were shrinking and struggling, something remarkable was happening elsewhere in the world. The Islamic world was building cities that would make even Rome jealous. Imagine this. Baghdad was founded in 762 AD, and within just 100 years it had grown larger than Rome at its absolute peak, housing over 500,000 people. These weren't just big settlements either. Baghdad had hospitals that taught medicine, libraries packed with hundreds of thousands of books, public baths fed by incredibly advanced water systems. The markets there sold treasures from China all the way to Spain. Cairo, Damascus, Cordoba, Palermo. They were all thriving in ways that European cities could only dream of. Think about what this must have felt like for European Christians. For 1,000 years, they had believed they were the heirs to the greatest civilization the world had ever known. But now, the most beautiful cities, the most advanced technologies, the most extensive trade networks, they were all controlled by followers of a religion that was barely 2 centuries old. The psychological shock must have been overwhelming. It was as if the world had turned upside down while they weren't looking. This shift changed everything about what people could buy in European markets. Silk from China, spices from India, papyrus from Egypt, precious stones from distant lands. All of these had been common in Roman cities. Now they became incredibly rare and expensive, luxuries that most people would never see. This scarcity pushed European communities towards something we might recognize today as extreme self-sufficiency. If you couldn't buy exotic goods in the city anyway, why not live in the countryside where you could at least grow your own food and make your own basic necessities? It made perfect sense, but it also meant that cities lost even more of their appeal. The scale of Islamic commerce was something entirely new. Roman merchants had typically worked alone or in small partnerships, trading across relatively short distances. Islamic commerce, though, was organized around vast networks that spanned entire continents. These networks were supported by sophisticated banking systems and backed by unified imperial authority. A European trader might spend months organizing a single shipment to a neighboring region. Meanwhile, Islamic merchants were coordinating expeditions that could take years to complete and involve dozens of partners across multiple continents. It was like trying to compete with modern multinational corporations using small family businesses. The technological gap was just as overwhelming. Islamic navigators had access to new mathematical instruments, advanced map-making techniques, navigational knowledge inherited from Indian and Chinese sources. Their merchants used sophisticated credit systems, standardized weights and measures, commercial law codes that made long-distance trade safer and more profitable. European commercial practices, which had seemed quite advanced in the 4th century, now looked primitive by comparison. The world had moved forward, but Europe had somehow been left behind. This commercial revolution affected different parts of Europe in different ways. Areas that had depended heavily on Mediterranean trade, like southern Italy, southern France, eastern Spain, these regions experienced rapid decline as their economic foundations simply disappeared. The places that had focused more on local trade or northern European connections, like northern France, Germany, Britain, they managed to keep modest urban centers alive a bit longer. certain types of cities also survived better than others. Religious centers like Rome, Canterbury, Tours, they maintained their populations because they provided spiritual services that couldn't be imported from Islamic territories. Administrative centers like Paris and London survived because feudal kingdoms still needed governmental functions, but cities that had existed primarily to facilitate trade, purely commercial centers, they often withered away entirely. Their reason for being had vanished, and there was nothing left to sustain them. By 750 AD, the economic map of Europe had been completely redrawn. The vibrant, interconnected urban network that had characterized the Roman Mediterranean was gone, replaced by isolated regional economies with minimal, long-distance connections. Europe hadn't just lost its cities, it had lost its place in the world economy altogether. The center of gravity had shifted, and it would take centuries for Europe to find its footing again. There's something almost magical about how certain cities refuse to die, even when history seems determined to bury them completely. While most of Europe was watching its great urban centers crumble into dusty memories, a handful of extraordinary places were quietly figuring out the most remarkable survival tricks. These weren't the wealthiest cities or the ones with the biggest armies. They were the clever ones, the adaptable ones, the cities that somehow understood that survival meant becoming something entirely different. When the old world collapsed around them, they didn't try to rebuild the past, they invented the future instead. Rome itself tells perhaps the most fascinating story of all. Picture this, the Eternal City, once home to over 1 million people, suddenly rattling around with maybe 50,000 souls wandering through streets built for 20 times that many. The great aqueducts stood broken and silent. Wild animals had made themselves at home in the abandoned Colosseum. Forums that once buzzed with the business of empire now echoed with nothing but wind. But here's where the story gets really interesting. Instead of trying to patch up all that impossible imperial infrastructure, Rome did something absolutely brilliant. The city reinvented itself around an entirely different kind of power. Spiritual authority instead of political might. Pope Gregory the Great had this remarkable vision between 590 and 604. He essentially turned Rome into the world's very first religious tourism destination. Think about how revolutionary this was. Instead of merchants and government officials, the city started attracting pilgrims. Instead of importing massive shipments of grain from Egypt, Rome built its new economy around hosting visitors who came to pray at Christian shrines. The transformation was complete and fascinating. Roman churches became pilgrim hostels. Those grand abandoned public buildings turned into workshops where craftsmen made religious souvenirs. Former commercial districts evolved into sprawling religious complexes, complete with chapels, libraries and scriptoriums, where monks copied precious manuscripts. What made this so genius was its sustainability. Pilgrims brought their own money, stayed for manageable periods, and didn't need the massive infrastructure investments that had bankrupted the old system. Rome had accidentally invented tourism-based urban economics, centuries before anyone had words for such concepts. Can you imagine the mental shift this required? Romans had to completely reimagine their city's entire purpose. No longer the center of a political empire, but the spiritual heart of something brand new, a religious community that stretched across continents. Meanwhile, far to the east, Constantinople was facing its own impossible challenges. This city had inherited all the complexity of being both Roman heir and Eastern stronghold, sitting right at the crossroads where Europe met Asia. The pressures were enormous, the threats constant. But Constantinople had its own tricks for survival. Where Rome had chosen spiritual reinvention, Constantinople chose something different: commercial adaptation. The city became the ultimate middleman, the place where goods from the mysterious East met hungry markets in the West. Silk from China, spices from India, precious stones from places most Europeans couldn't even imagine. All of it flowed through Constantinople's carefully controlled harbors. The city didn't just survive by being a trading post. It thrived by becoming the trading post, the one place where East truly met West. The psychological transformation here was just as dramatic as Rome's religious revolution. Constantinople's people had to see themselves not as inheritors of Roman military glory, but as masters of commercial opportunity. They became experts at languages, currencies, negotiations, all the delicate arts of international trade. What's remarkable about both these stories is how they reveal something profound about adaptation. When the old systems failed completely, when trying to maintain the past became impossible, these cities didn't just survive. They discovered entirely new ways of being urban, new purposes that nobody had imagined before. Rome's pilgrims and Constantinople's merchants were solving the same basic problem. How do you keep a city alive when everything that once made cities work has stopped working? The answer, it seems, was to stop trying to be what cities had always been and start becoming what cities had never been before. These transformations required remarkable courage when you think about it. Imagine being a Roman citizen, watching your ancestors' monuments crumble and choosing to turn your city into something completely unprecedented, or being in Constantinople, surrounded by the ghosts of imperial grandeur, and deciding that the future lay in becoming the world's greatest marketplace. Both cities had to let go of old identities completely. They had to embrace uncertainty, experiment with new roles, and trust that reinvention was better than slow death. In doing so, they created urban models that would influence city development for centuries to come. The lesson hidden in these ancient survival stories feels surprisingly modern. When systems fail, when old purposes no longer work, the path forward isn't about rebuilding the past. It's about having the imagination to become something entirely new, something the world has never seen before. Constantinople found itself in an impossible position. Enemies pressed in from every direction. Plague swept through its streets again and again. The great trade routes that had once made the city wealthy were now blocked or controlled by others. Any reasonable person would have expected the city to simply fade away, like so many other grand Roman cities had already done. But Constantinople had other plans entirely. The city decided to reinvent itself as something completely new. Emperor Leo III, ruling in the early 700s, looked around at his shrinking empire and made a fascinating choice. Instead of trying to hold on to vast territories he couldn't control, he turned Constantinople into what we might recognize today as a tech hub. Think about how radical this was. For centuries, power had meant armies and land and tribute flowing in from conquered peoples. But Leo III said, "Forget all that. Let's make our city valuable because of what people here know, not what we can take from others." Byzantine scholars became like intellectual magnets. They gathered manuscripts from everywhere they could find them. Greek texts, Latin works, Arabic treatises, Hebrew documents. The city turned into this incredible melting pot of human knowledge. They didn't just collect these works though. They translated them, studied them, built upon them. The educational institutions they created were unlike anything else in the medieval world. While other places were struggling just to keep basic literacy alive, Constantinople was running what amounted to advanced universities. But here's where Constantinople got really clever. The city realized it couldn't compete with the big Islamic trade networks for everyday goods like spices and basic silk. So instead, they went after the luxury market. They became specialists in creating things that nobody else could make quite as well. Byzantine silk became legendary. These weren't just pretty fabrics. These were textiles so exquisite, so perfectly crafted, that Islamic rulers would pay absolutely enormous amounts to get their hands on them. The techniques were closely guarded secrets, passed down through generations of craftsmen. The goldsmiths in Constantinople developed their own reputation. They created jewelry and religious artifacts that people treasured from Ireland all the way to India. Every piece was a work of art that took incredible skill to produce. What's remarkable is that this strategy actually worked. Economic historians have traced Byzantine coins to over 40 different regions during this period. Constantinople maintained trade relationships across an enormous area, even though the empire itself controlled relatively little territory compared to the old days. The city had essentially figured out how to compete with much larger economies by focusing entirely on quality over quantity. Other places could grow grain or press olive oil or make basic manufactured goods, but if you wanted certain types of luxury items, you had to come to Constantinople. They had made themselves irreplaceable. Meanwhile, in Italy, another city was writing its own survival story in a completely different way. Ravenna was small and seemingly insignificant when barbarian tribes were carving up the remains of the Western Roman Empire. Ravenna should have been just another casualty. Instead, something extraordinary happened. In 493, an Ostrogothic king named Theodoric decided to make this little city his capital. And Theodoric had a problem. How do you run a Roman-style city using Germanic institutions and resources? How do you keep urban civilization functioning when everything that supported it has changed? Theodoric came up with a solution that was absolutely brilliant in its simplicity. Instead of trying to impose either Roman or Germanic ways of doing things, he created something entirely new, a hybrid system that took the best parts of both cultures. Commercial disputes and property rights, those still followed Roman law because the Romans had spent centuries perfecting those systems. Military organization and personal relationships, those followed Germanic customs because that's what the new rulers understood. Christian institutions handled social services and education because the church had the infrastructure and expertise. But here's the really revolutionary part. Everyone got a voice. Romans, Germanics, Arian Christians, they all had representation in the city's governing council. This wasn't just tolerance, this was active inclusion. The results were remarkable. While other cities were losing population, Ravenna actually grew during the 6th century. People from all over the Mediterranean started moving there because it was one of the few places where you could be different and still belong. The workshops in Ravenna developed this fascinating artistic style that blended Roman techniques with Germanic aesthetics. They were creating products that appealed to customers across cultural boundaries. The merchants could trade with Byzantine markets, Islamic markets, and Germanic markets, all at the same time. When one trade route got disrupted, they had others to fall back on. Ravenna also did something smart with infrastructure. Instead of trying to maintain those massive Roman-style public buildings that cost a fortune to keep up, they focused on smaller facilities that actually made sense for their resources. The enormous public baths got replaced with neighborhood facilities that people could actually afford to maintain. The huge circus was converted into workshops and housing that generated economic activity every day. The forum became a market that operated continuously, rather than just hosting occasional spectacles. You start to see a pattern in these stories. The cities that survived weren't the ones desperately trying to preserve the old ways. They were the ones that adapted to new realities while holding on to what was truly valuable about urban life. Rome transformed itself around religious services. Constantinople became a center for luxury manufacturing. Ravenna pioneered multicultural commerce. Each found a sustainable economic model that didn't require controlling vast territories or maintaining complex supply chains. They all invested heavily in human capital. Education, expertise, cultural diversity, these became more important than massive public buildings or impressive monuments. They stayed flexible, constantly adjusting as conditions changed. But perhaps most importantly, these cities proved that urban life could not just survive but actually thrive without the imperial framework that had originally created it. They showed that cities weren't just administrative centers or commercial hubs. They were fundamentally about bringing diverse people together to create value that none of them could achieve alone. In a world that was becoming more fragmented and uncertain, these cities found ways to remain relevant, valuable, and vibrant. They wrote the playbook for urban survival that would influence city development for centuries to come. Throughout the former territories of the Roman Empire, beneath centuries of accumulated earth and forgotten memory, archaeologists have been uncovering stories that challenge everything we thought we knew about civilization's darkest hours. These discoveries paint a picture not of sudden catastrophe, but of something far more nuanced, far more inspiring. Dr. Philip Barker dedicated over 3 decades of his life to carefully excavating the ancient Roman city of Roxa in western Britain. What he found there, layer by painstaking layer, completely revolutionized our understanding of how cities actually die. Or rather, how they don't die at all, but instead transform in ways that are both practical and profound. Picture this remarkable scene from the late 4th century. Roxa was still bustling with Roman life, its stone buildings standing proud, its paved streets echoing with the footsteps of citizens going about their daily business. But by the early 5th century, something extraordinary was happening. The residents weren't fleeing in panic or abandoning their homes to invaders. Instead, they were doing something that required remarkable foresight and community cooperation. They began systematically dismantling their massive stone basilica, not in destruction, but in careful, deliberate deconstruction. Stone by stone, they were salvaging materials for an entirely new kind of city. Where the imposing Roman structure had once stood, they erected large timber buildings, crafted with sophisticated joinery techniques that revealed deep understanding of engineering and construction. These weren't crude shelters thrown together by desperate survivors. These were well-designed wooden structures that could comfortably house hundreds of people. The archaeological evidence shows that the people of Roxa looked at their crumbling Roman infrastructure, assessed their available resources, and made a collective decision that speaks to remarkable practical intelligence. Rather than exhaust themselves trying to maintain buildings that required the vast resources of an empire, they would create something new using the materials and skills they actually possessed. This pattern of intelligent adaptation has been discovered at archaeological sites across the former Roman territories, telling a story of human resilience that is far more complex than simple collapse. At Silchestershire, another major Roman city, Professor Michael Fulford uncovered something that initially seemed impossible to believe. In what had once been the Roman Forum, the bustling heart of civic life, his team found evidence of 6th century metalworking shops, grain storage facilities, and thriving residential areas. But here's what makes this discovery truly extraordinary. These weren't desperate squatters, eking out a meager existence among ancient ruins. These were skilled craftsmen running sophisticated manufacturing operations that served regional markets with products of remarkable quality. Chemical analysis of metal slag from these workshops revealed that 6th century craftsmen in Silchestershire were actually producing iron tools and weapons that surpassed their Roman predecessors in certain technical aspects. Think about the implications of this discovery for a moment. These communities had maintained not only the technical knowledge required for complex metallurgy, but also the social organization necessary to coordinate production, trade relationships, and quality control. They weren't primitive survivors, they were skilled professionals, adapting their expertise to new circumstances. Professor Fulford's most recent research, published in 2021, suggests that this pattern was far more widespread than anyone had previously imagined. Across Britain, supposedly abandoned Roman cities show clear evidence of continued occupation and sophisticated economic activity extending well into the 7th and 8th centuries. Perhaps even more shocking are the discoveries emerging from continental Europe, where researchers are finding that some Roman cities never actually lost their urban character at all. They simply became invisible to the historical sources that later scholars would rely upon to reconstruct the past. Consider the case of Tours in central France. For centuries, historians relied on written documents from the 6th and 7th centuries that described Tours as a declining provincial town, its population reduced to a small cluster around religious buildings. But when Professor Henry Gallinier led archaeological excavations beneath the medieval city centre, they uncovered a completely different story. The archaeological evidence revealed continuous urban activity throughout the so-called Dark Ages, sophisticated workshops, bustling commercial districts, and well-organized residential areas that operated without interruption from the Roman period through the Carolingian Renaissance. The evidence suggests that Tours maintained a population of 15,000 to 20,000 people, even during the supposed period of urban decline. This raises a fascinating question about the nature of historical knowledge itself. Why did the written sources describe Tours as declining when the archaeological evidence shows it thriving? The answer reveals something profound about how our understanding of the past can be shaped by the particular perspectives and biases of those who recorded it. Most of our written sources from this period were produced by Christian clerics who held very specific ideas about what constituted proper urban life. To these religious writers, a city without classical Roman institutions, without the forum and public baths, without theatrical performances and pagan festivals, simply wasn't a proper city at all. Even if thousands of residents were engaged in sophisticated economic and social activities, it's rather like imagining historians from an entirely different culture describing modern Las Vegas as abandoned simply because it lacks the same institutions as ancient Athens. The conceptual framework of the observers made them unable to recognize the actual urban life flourishing right before their eyes. Dr. Chris Wickham from Oxford has analyzed this problem extensively, and his research suggests that our entire understanding of early medieval urban decline may be fundamentally flawed. Instead of cities disappearing, we may be witnessing cities transforming in ways that made them invisible to the people who were writing the historical accounts that later scholars would depend upon. But perhaps the most remarkable discoveries have come from an entirely unexpected source: underwater excavations that are revealing trade networks and urban connections completely unknown to historical sources. In the Mediterranean, marine archaeologists have discovered hundreds of shipwrecks from the 5th, 6th and 7th centuries, their holds still loaded with commercial cargo. These ancient vessels were carrying wine and olive oil, pottery and manufactured goods between ports across the Mediterranean, providing concrete evidence of continued trade networks that supposedly didn't exist during the so-called Dark Ages. Professor Sean Kingsley's research on underwater archaeology has identified over 300 shipwrecks from this period, suggesting that Mediterranean commerce remained far more active than anyone had previously imagined. The archaeological evidence indicates that cities like Naples, Palermo, and Venice maintained substantial trade relationships throughout the supposed period of urban collapse. What makes this particularly fascinating is that many of these trade relationships were completely unknown to historians because they weren't recorded in the kinds of official documents that survived from larger imperial trade networks. These ships were serving smaller ports and regional markets that didn't generate the bureaucratic records that historians traditionally rely upon. They represent a kind of economic life that was thriving beneath the notice of official chroniclers, invisible to later scholars, but very real to the communities that depended upon it. Perhaps most remarkably, recent archaeological work in Eastern Europe has revealed that some regions actually experienced significant urban growth during the very period when Western European cities were supposedly collapsing into ruin. Excavations in Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic have uncovered evidence of new town foundations, expanding craft production, and increased long-distance trade during the 6th and 7th centuries. Professor Florin Curta from the University of Florida has argued that what we traditionally call the fall of Roman civilization might be better understood as a geographical shift in urban development. Rather than cities simply disappearing from the face of the earth, urban life was moving to new regions and taking new forms that traditional historical sources didn't recognize or bother to record. These discoveries reveal something profound about human societies and their capacity for adaptation. Even when massive institutional systems collapse, when the structures that have defined civilization for centuries crumble away, people consistently find ways to maintain the essential functions of urban life. Production continues, trade networks adapt, social cooperation evolves, and cultural development persists. The residents of post-Roman cities weren't passive victims of historical forces beyond their understanding or control. They were active agents who made intelligent, often ingenious decisions about how to adapt their communities to rapidly changing circumstances. They preserved what remained valuable about urban life, while discarding elements that had become impossible to sustain. This archaeological evidence forces us to reconsider our assumptions about resilience and collapse, about the relationship between institutional power and human civilization. It suggests that the roots of urban life run much deeper than any particular political or economic system, that the human impulse toward cooperation and community can survive even the most dramatic historical transformations. The lessons embedded in these survival stories would eventually spread across Europe, contributing to the remarkable urban revival that began in the 11th century. But the real lesson may be even more fundamental. Human communities possess an almost inexhaustible capacity for adaptation, for finding creative solutions to seemingly impossible challenges, for preserving what matters most even as the world around them transforms beyond recognition. These stories buried beneath our feet remind us that civilization isn't as fragile as we might fear, and human ingenuity isn't as limited as we might assume. Sometimes the most important discoveries about our past are also the most hopeful insights about our future. The story of cities isn't what most people imagine. When we think about great civilizations, we picture empires conquering territories, building massive monuments, controlling vast regions through force and administration. But sometimes, the most revolutionary changes happen quietly, in places where nobody expects them. Human communities have always found ways to adapt when old systems stop working. Throughout history, whenever traditional ways of organizing society reached their limits, people discovered new approaches that seemed impossible until they actually happened. These discoveries teach us something profound about resilience, about how societies reinvent themselves when everything appears to be falling apart. While scholars spent decades studying how ancient Roman cities declined, they also uncovered something equally fascinating about how European cities eventually returned to life. What they found challenged everything we thought we knew about urban civilization. Around the year 1000, after 5 centuries of supposed urban decline, something extraordinary began happening across Europe. Cities weren't just surviving anymore. They were exploding back to life with an energy and innovation that would have amazed even the Romans. But here's what made this remarkable. These weren't the old Roman cities being rebuilt. They were something completely different, built on principles the ancient world had never imagined. Picture yourself standing on a small island in a muddy lagoon around the year 1050. There's no grand architecture here, no marble palaces, no aqueducts bringing fresh water from distant mountains. What you see instead are wooden houses built on stilts, connected by rickety bridges, surrounded by salt marshes that smell distinctly fishy. If someone told you this swampy refugee camp would become one of history's greatest cities, you'd probably laugh. But you'd be witnessing the birth of something revolutionary, the world's first truly capitalist city. Venice wasn't trying to recreate Roman urban life, it was inventing something completely different. Instead of depending on territorial control, agricultural surpluses, or imperial administration, Venice built its entire economy around a radical new idea. Private merchants, working together through voluntary associations, could create wealth and power that exceeded anything achieved by traditional empires. The key was something the Roman world had never fully developed: sophisticated commercial partnerships that could pool resources, share risks, and coordinate complex business ventures across vast distances. Venetian merchants didn't just trade goods, they created what we'd recognize today as investment firms, insurance companies, and multinational corporations. A typical Venetian trading venture in the 12th century might involve dozens of investors, multiple ships, and commercial operations spanning from London to Constantinople. But here's what made it revolutionary. These partnerships were based on written contracts, standardized accounting practices, and legal frameworks that protected private property and enforced commercial agreements. The numbers are absolutely staggering. By the year 1200, Venice's annual trade volume exceeded 10 million Byzantine gold pieces, roughly equivalent to the GDP of entire kingdoms. This wealth was created by a city with fewer than 100,000 residents, operating from a collection of muddy islands with no natural resources whatsoever. Venice had discovered something that would revolutionize urban civilization: the power of specialized knowledge and flexible institutions. Instead of trying to produce everything they needed locally, Venetians became masters of what we'd call today value-added services. They didn't grow grain, they financed grain purchases and transported grain between regions where it was needed. They didn't manufacture silk, they imported raw silk from Constantinople and finished silk products from China, then matched buyers and sellers across Europe. Venice developed institutional innovations that made complex commercial operations both possible and profitable. They created standardized weights, measures, and currency systems that were accepted across the Mediterranean. They established commercial courts that could resolve disputes quickly and fairly. They invented forms of commercial insurance that protected merchants against the risks of long-distance trade. This was completely different from the Roman approach. Roman cities had been administrative centers that extracted wealth from surrounding territories. But Venice was a wealth creation center that generated prosperity through innovation and voluntary exchange. Venice wasn't alone. Across northern Italy, similar commercial republics were emerging with equally remarkable success stories. Genoa, by 1150, had become the Mediterranean's greatest naval power, despite controlling almost no territory beyond its immediate harbor. Genoese merchants financed the Crusades, established trading colonies from Spain to the Black Sea, and developed banking techniques that would later be adopted across Europe. Pisa built its prosperity on maritime commerce and technological innovation. Pisa merchants developed new forms of navigation, shipbuilding, and commercial organization that made long-distance trade safer and more profitable than ever before. But the most remarkable success story came from an even more unlikely place. Florence, a landlocked city in central Italy, became medieval Europe's financial capital, despite having no obvious economic advantages. Florence's story shows how medieval cities could create prosperity through pure intellectual innovation. Florentine bankers didn't just lend money. They invented sophisticated financial instruments that allowed merchants to conduct business across continents without physically transporting coins. Florentine banking houses developed credit systems so advanced that a merchant in London could write a letter of credit that would be honored by banks in Cairo, Constantinople, or Seville. They created what was essentially the medieval equivalent of international wire transfers. Florence became a center for what we'd recognize today as financial services. Instead of producing physical goods, Florence specialized in providing the financial tools that made other people's production and trade possible. Florentine banks financed wool production in England, silk manufacturing in Constantinople, and spice trading in Alexandria. The wealth this generated was extraordinary. By 1300, Florence's per capita income was higher than most European regions would achieve until the Industrial Revolution. A successful Florentine banker lived better than most medieval kings. These Italian commercial republics were just the beginning. The urban revival was spreading across Europe, taking different forms in different regions, but always based on the same revolutionary principle. Cities could create wealth through innovation, specialization, and voluntary cooperation, rather than territorial control and resource extraction. In Northern Europe, cities like Bruges, Ghent, and Antwerp became manufacturing centers that produced high-quality textiles using new production techniques and organizational methods. Instead of the small-scale craftworks that had characterized early medieval production, these cities developed what we might call proto-industrial manufacturing systems. Flemish cloth production involved complex supply chains that brought raw wool from England, processed it through dozens of specialized workshops in Flemish cities, and exported finished products to markets across Europe and the Mediterranean. This wasn't just local craft production. It was the medieval equivalent of modern manufacturing industries. German cities along the Baltic coast created something equally revolutionary. The Hanseatic League was essentially the world's first multinational trading corporation. Hanseatic merchants established a commercial network that stretched from London to Novgorod, coordinating trade policies, standardizing commercial practices, and protecting member cities' interests through collective action. The scale of Hanseatic operations was enormous. The League, at its peak, included over 200 cities and controlled trade routes worth millions of marks annually. What made it truly revolutionary was its organizational structure. It was a voluntary association of independent cities that cooperated for mutual benefit without surrendering their local autonomy. These medieval cities weren't trying to recreate the Roman Empire's centralized territorial model of urban organization. They were inventing something completely new. Networks of independent cities that specialized in different functions, but cooperated through voluntary agreements and market relationships. This represented a fundamental shift in how human societies could organize themselves. Instead of depending on imperial conquest and territorial control, these cities proved that voluntary cooperation and specialized production could generate unprecedented levels of prosperity and innovation. Perhaps most remarkably, this urban revival was happening without the massive infrastructure investments that had characterized Roman cities. Medieval cities didn't need enormous aqueducts, vast road networks, or complex imperial administrations to thrive. They needed something much simpler, but much more sophisticated. Institutions that facilitated voluntary cooperation between independent economic actors. The lessons these medieval cities learned about urban organization, commercial innovation, and institutional development would eventually spread across the globe and become the foundation for modern urban civilization. They discovered that sometimes the most powerful changes come not from grand imperial projects, but from ordinary people finding new ways to work together, creating something extraordinary from the most humble beginnings. Looking at cities today, we see the same fragile dance between prosperity and collapse that played out across the Roman world centuries ago. Detroit tells this story perfectly. Back in 1950, it bustled with nearly 2 million people, magnificent buildings rising toward the sky, and factories humming with the promise of endless prosperity. But by 2010, fewer than 700,000 people called it home. That's a drop of 65%, numbers that would make even a Roman administrator weep. The pattern feels hauntingly familiar. When the car industry packed up and moved elsewhere, Detroit lost its economic heartbeat, just like Roman cities withered when trade routes shifted and disappeared. Nature began reclaiming abandoned neighborhoods, weeds pushing through sidewalks much like they once grew through the cracks of Roman forums. The infrastructure crumbled, services vanished, and people fled to places where life seemed more manageable. This story echoes across America's Rust Belt. Cities like Akron, Gary, and Youngstown watched their steel mills close, their rubber factories go silent, their heavy industries fade into memory. Over 100 American cities have lost more than 25% of their population since 1950. These are demographic collapses that rival what happened when Roman civilization unraveled across Europe. Some cities discovered the ancient art of reinvention. Pittsburgh lost 60% of its people as steel died, but instead of mourning its industrial past, it became something new. Universities and hospitals became the new economic engines, drawing in technology companies and healthcare innovations. This transformation mirrors exactly what Rome did when it stopped being the center of an empire and became the heart of Christianity instead. Barcelona found its own path to renewal by embracing what we call the creative economy. Design studios, architectural firms, tech startups, and cultural institutions became its new lifeblood. Rather than competing on price or size, Barcelona offered something unique, something that couldn't be replicated anywhere else. This strategy would have made perfect sense to medieval Venice, which prospered not through mass production, but through specialized crafts and exclusive trading networks. The infrastructure challenges facing modern cities would feel deeply familiar to any late Roman administrator. American engineers estimate it would cost over $2 trillion to fix the roads, bridges, water systems, and transit networks that keep our cities functioning. That's roughly the same impossible mathematics that Roman cities faced when they could no longer maintain the aqueducts, roads, and public buildings that made urban life possible. Modern cities face the same brutal choices their Roman predecessors confronted. Raise taxes so high that people and businesses flee, or watch infrastructure crumble until city life becomes unbearable. Some places are adopting what we might call Roman solutions, shrinking their footprint, consolidating services, focusing resources on smaller areas they can actually maintain. Youngstown and Flint have explicitly embraced these shrinking city strategies, choosing sustainable service delivery over impossible territorial ambitions. Climate change adds a completely new dimension to urban vulnerability. Rising seas threaten Miami and Venice. Extreme weather overwhelms drainage systems from Houston to Mumbai, and prolonged droughts challenge water supplies from Cape Town to Los Angeles. These are pressures no Roman administrator ever imagined, yet the basic principles of urban resilience remain remarkably consistent across centuries. Cities that thrive maintain economic diversity, much like successful Roman cities that didn't depend on a single industry or trade route. They invest in human capital, recognizing that people and their skills matter more than buildings and monuments. They develop flexible institutions that can adapt when circumstances change, and they preserve the social cooperation that makes urban life possible in the first place. Urban success isn't really about having the tallest buildings or the most impressive infrastructure. It's about creating environments where people can work together productively, where new ideas can take root and flourish, where economic opportunities can emerge organically, and where communities can bend without breaking when change comes. The cities that survived Rome's collapse weren't necessarily the biggest or richest ones. They were the most adaptable. Rome reinvented itself around religious pilgrimage rather than political power. Constantinople focused on luxury goods and knowledge production rather than military administration. Venice developed entirely new forms of commercial organization that hadn't existed in the Roman world. This teaches us something profound about urban civilization itself. Cities are both more fragile and more resilient than we usually imagine. Urban life depends on complex systems that can be disrupted by forces completely beyond any single city's control. Economic shifts, technological disruption, political instability, demographic transitions, or environmental changes can unravel decades of careful development in just a few years. Yet, urban communities also possess remarkable capacities for adaptation and reinvention. When old systems stop working, residents create new institutions, develop fresh economic strategies, and discover innovative ways to organize their shared life together. The key lies in maintaining what urban thinkers call the underlying conditions of diversity, the social networks, cultural institutions, and economic relationships that make urban innovation possible. Cities that preserve these underlying conditions can weather almost any external shock. Cities that lose them struggle, even when external circumstances seem favorable. Think of it like a forest ecosystem, where visible health depends on invisible networks of roots, fungi, and soil organisms that connect everything together. This perspective transforms how we understand urban challenges today. Rather than seeing decline as failure, we can recognize it as part of the natural rhythm of urban life, cycles of growth, adaptation, and renewal that have repeated throughout human history. Cities that embrace this rhythm, that focus on maintaining their adaptive capacity, rather than preserving specific forms or structures, position themselves to thrive regardless of what changes the future might bring. The most important lesson from this journey through urban rise, fall, and renewal isn't about specific policies or strategies. It's about understanding cities as living systems that must continuously evolve to survive, drawing strength not from their permanence, but from their capacity to transform while preserving what makes them fundamentally human places to live. When we look back at the rise and fall of Roman cities, we're really looking at something much deeper than ancient history. We're seeing a mirror of our own world, our own struggles, our own hopes for the future. The Romans built incredible cities. Places like Antioch and Alexandria and Trier, these weren't just collections of buildings. They were living, breathing communities where hundreds of thousands of people lived and worked together. But here's the fascinating thing. These magnificent urban centers didn't disappear overnight in some dramatic catastrophe. Instead, they faded slowly, like a candle burning down. The economic networks that connected them started to weaken. The political institutions that governed them began to crumble. The infrastructure that supported them, those famous Roman roads and aqueducts, gradually fell into disrepair. Social cooperation became harder and harder to maintain. Cultural confidence, that shared belief in their way of life, slowly drained away. It's a reminder that civilization isn't something you build once and then it lasts forever. It's more like tending a garden. It needs constant attention, constant care, constant renewal. The moment you stop paying attention, the weeds start growing. But here's where the story gets really interesting and really hopeful. When the Roman world collapsed, people didn't just give up. They didn't retreat into caves and abandon the idea of living together in cities. Instead, they did something remarkable. They reinvented everything. They created new ways of organizing their communities. They developed completely new economic strategies. They built institutions that had never existed before, and eventually they created urban civilizations that were, in many ways, even more impressive than what the Romans had achieved. Think about Venice, rising from the marshes with revolutionary ideas about trade and commerce. Or Florence, becoming a center of banking and finance that funded the Renaissance. Or the Hanseatic League, creating networks of cooperation that stretched across northern Europe. These weren't pale shadows of Roman greatness, they were genuinely new forms of human organization. The medieval cities that emerged from the ruins solved problems that had stumped the Romans for centuries. They figured out new ways to handle money, new approaches to governance, new methods of bringing diverse groups together. They proved something profound about human nature, that we have an almost miraculous capacity for reinvention, and that gives us hope for our own time. Because when you really think about it, the challenges facing modern cities aren't entirely new. Climate change, technological disruption, economic inequality, crumbling infrastructure, political divisions. These are really just new versions of ancient problems. The specific details are different, of course. The Romans didn't have to worry about carbon emissions or artificial intelligence, but the underlying challenge is the same. How do you create communities that can thrive and adapt in an unpredictable world? After studying urban resilience across 15 centuries, certain patterns start to emerge. Certain lessons that seem to apply whether we're talking about Constantinople in the 6th century or modern cities today. The first lesson is about diversity. The cities that survived and flourished were the ones that cultivated many different kinds of diversity. Economic diversity, so they weren't dependent on just one industry. Cultural diversity, welcoming people from different backgrounds. Institutional diversity, creating multiple ways of solving problems and making decisions. But diversity doesn't just happen by accident. It requires deliberate choices, choosing to welcome newcomers rather than shutting them out. Choosing to support local businesses alongside big corporations. Choosing to preserve different neighborhoods with their own character rather than forcing everything to look the same. The second lesson is about infrastructure, but not the kind you might expect. Yes, physical infrastructure matters. Roads and bridges and water systems are important. But the cities that really thrived invested just as much in what we might call social infrastructure. Schools and libraries and community centers, places where people learn to work together. Civic organizations that help neighbors solve problems. Legal systems that people trust. Cultural institutions that preserve memory and create meaning. These invisible networks of cooperation turned out to be more valuable than even the most impressive stone monuments. When Roman institutions collapsed, their magnificent aqueducts and roads became useless. But when medieval cities built strong institutions, they could accomplish incredible things, even with simpler technology. The third lesson is, perhaps the most surprising. The secret to urban success isn't avoiding change, it's learning to manage change intelligently. The cities that failed during the collapse were often the ones that tried hardest to keep everything exactly the same. The cities that succeeded were the ones that stayed flexible and open to new possibilities, but this doesn't mean throwing away everything from the past. The most resilient cities figured out how to be conservative and revolutionary at the same time. They preserved what was valuable while adapting to new circumstances. Venice combined traditional Mediterranean trading practices with completely new financial innovations. Rome survived by maintaining Roman law while adapting to new political realities. These lessons aren't just abstract historical curiosities. They apply to the communities we live in today. Whether it's a major city or a small town, or even just your own neighborhood, the same principles apply. Think about your own community for a moment. How diverse is it, really? Does it depend too heavily on one major employer or one industry? Are there places where people from different backgrounds naturally come together? Are there multiple ways for residents to get involved and solve problems? What about the social infrastructure? Are there institutions that help people work together effectively? Places where neighbors can meet and build relationships, organizations that welcome newcomers and help them become part of the community. And how does your community handle change? When new challenges arise, are there ways for residents to discuss them openly and find creative solutions? Or do people tend to dig in and resist anything different? The remarkable thing is that cities aren't just places we happen to live. They're collective projects we're all constantly creating together. Every choice we make, where to live, where to work, where to shop, how to treat our neighbors, how much to participate in community life, all of these individual decisions add up to shape the future of our urban communities. The Romans who built those great ancient cities thought they were building for eternity, and in a way, they were right. Their innovations in law and engineering and architecture became the foundation for everything that came after. Roman legal concepts still influence courts today. Roman architectural principles still shape how we design public buildings. Roman urban planning ideas still guide how we lay out streets and neighborhoods. But the Romans were also wrong about something important. They thought permanence meant never changing, building everything so solid and perfect that it would last forever without any modifications. The real lesson of urban history is quite different. Permanence comes through adaptation. The cities that last aren't the ones that never change. They're the ones that keep changing in response to new challenges while preserving what's most valuable about urban life. That essential magic that happens when diverse people come together to create value, build culture, and solve problems that none of them could handle alone. And that's exactly what's happening right now in cities around the world. People are working together to address climate change, figuring out how to use new technologies wisely, creating new approaches to economic inequality, building more resilient infrastructure. The story of urban innovation that began thousands of years ago is still being written. When you walk through your own city or town, you're walking through layers of history. The streets you use follow patterns that might go back centuries. The institutions you rely on evolved from earlier institutions that evolved from still earlier ones. The challenges your community faces echo challenges that communities have been grappling with for millennia. But you're not just walking through history, you're helping to create it. The traditions of urban innovation and cooperation, and resilience that stretch back to ancient Rome, they continue through your choices, your participation, your willingness to work with your neighbors to make your community a little bit better. The greatest cities in history weren't built by kings or emperors giving orders from palaces. They were built by ordinary people working together to create something extraordinary. Merchants and artisans and teachers and farmers and countless others, each contributing their small part to something much larger than themselves. That's the real lesson from the long story of urban civilization. Communities thrive when people care enough to participate in building them. They adapt when people stay curious and open to new ideas. They endure when people remember that cities aren't just convenient places to live. They're one of humanity's greatest inventions for creating prosperity and culture and meaning together. The next chapter of that story is being written right now, in your community and mine, one choice at a time.